Yo, what's up everyone? It's Eclipse Wizardry, and today we're checking out, what if Fleur's Veela claiming mark at age 7 made Hermione Daphne and Tonks fight to be his second mate. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1. The mark. The thing about Diagon Alley on a Saturday in July was that it never quite decided what it wanted to be. Crowded one moment, oddly still the next, as if the whole street was breathing. Shop fronts leaned toward each other overhead like gossiping neighbors, and the smell of the place, ink and cauldron smoke and something sweetly medicinal drifting from the apothecary, hit you before you even got through the leaky cauldron's back door. Harry Potter was 7 years old, and he was trying very hard not to look like he'd never seen any of this before. He hadn't, of course. He'd never seen any of it. But something in him, something new and persistent that had started humming under his skin about 3 weeks ago, around the time he'd accidentally turned his teacher's wig blue and then calmly told her it had been like that when he arrived, told him that wide eyes and open mouths were for people who didn't know how to handle things. So he kept his face still and his eyes moving, and he walked a careful 2 steps behind his Aunt Petunia, who was walking a careful 2 steps behind the witch from the ministry who was explaining, in a brisk voice, about the statute of secrecy and accidental magic protocols and what would happen if Harry did anything in public without authorization. Harry wasn't really listening. He was watching everything else. The ministry witch, her name was Arabella something, though she'd said it quickly and hadn't repeated it, had appeared at Privet Drive 3 weeks ago following what the formal letter had called a significant and uncontrolled magical event of Category 3 or above. The blue wig had apparently been Category 2. The thing that happened to Dudley's birthday cake, where it had floated off the table and then gently deposited itself upside down on Vernon's head with a kind of quiet dignity, had apparently been Category 4. After that, the ministry sent someone. Petunia was walking with the stiffness of someone who had been very thoroughly ashamed of herself for years and had gotten good at it. She didn't speak to Harry. She addressed the ministry witch in clipped, efficient sentences, and the ministry witch responded in kind, and Harry watched a man in deep purple robes examine a stack of books outside a shop with the casual interest of someone who had nothing pressing to do. He wondered if the books could talk. He hoped they could. The ministry witch stopped in front of a shop with an apothecary sign and turned to Petunia with a clipboard. "I'll need you to sign the temporary guardianship consent for the initial assessment. It's standard when a child displays Category 4 accidental events before primary education age." She paused and looked at Harry over the clipboard. "You can wait just inside the door if you'd like." Harry didn't want to wait inside the door. He stepped past her before Petunia could object and moved into the alley proper, which was, in that particular stretch, briefly less crowded, and stood in the middle of it and looked up at the way the rooftops leaned together and let the whole thing settle over him like something he'd been waiting to find. He was standing there, just standing, taking it in, not performing wonder but actually feeling it somewhere deep behind his ribs, when someone walked into him from the left. Not hard. Just a collision of the ordinary kind, small person meeting small person, and he turned and found himself looking at a girl. She was about his age, maybe a year older, with silver blonde hair that fell to her waist in a way that seemed like it had a separate existence from the rest of her, moving a half-second behind her actual movement. Her eyes were blue-gray, pale enough to seem lit from behind, and she was wearing robes that were clearly French in cut because they were slightly too elegant for a Saturday morning. She was also clearly furious, in the way children are when they've been dragged somewhere they don't want to be and then embarrassed on top of it. She was also, Harry noticed with the clinical detachment of someone who had spent years being invisible, very deliberately not crying, which suggested she'd been close to it before the collision. "Pardon," she said, in accented English, already pulling back. "It's fine," Harry said. She looked at him. Not the quick look of a stranger assessing whether an apology had been accepted, but an actual look, like she was trying to figure out a problem and his face was part of it. Harry looked back. He didn't look away, because he'd learned early that looking away was for people who were scared of what they'd find, and he wasn't scared of a girl with silver hair in the middle of Diagon Alley. Something passed between them in that moment, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Something actual. A sensation like warm water running from her hands, which had caught his arms when they collided and hadn't yet let go, up through his elbows and into his chest and down his spine, arriving in the base of his stomach as something that was heat and recognition and a sound he didn't hear with his ears. The girl made a small, sharp sound and pulled her hands back. She looked at her palms. Harry looked at his arms, where her hands had been. There was nothing visible. But the warmth didn't fade the way warmth should. It settled, and stayed, like something finding a home. Fleur. A woman's voice, French, sharp with anxiety that was trying to sound like irritation. A woman appeared from the direction of Gringotts, beautiful in the way that made Harry understand, instinctively, that she and the girl were related because beauty like that didn't happen twice in a family without a pattern, and she stopped when she saw them. Something changed in her expression. Something complicated and quick. The girl, Fleur, apparently, turned to the woman. She said something in rapid French that Harry couldn't follow but which had the rhythm of denial, of but I didn't, of I don't know what happened. The woman crouched down in front of Fleur with quick, careful movements. She took Fleur's hands and looked at them and then looked at Harry with an expression that had moved well past complicated into something that was almost careful. Like she was trying not to startle him. "You are Harry Potter," she said. It wasn't a question. Harry considered lying, out of habit, then decided against it. Yes. The woman held his gaze for a moment. She was, he could tell, even at 7, a person who was used to being the most significant presence in any room, and she was currently choosing not to be, which was its own kind of impressive. "My name is Hermione Delacour," she said. "This is my daughter Fleur. Something has happened between you that," she paused, looked at Fleur, and switched to French for a sentence or two, soft and quick. Fleur's face did several things in rapid succession. Shock was first. Then something he couldn't name, something that looked almost like recognition, like she'd heard a story about something and was now realizing the story was real. Then she looked at Harry again with those pale, lit-up eyes and said, in English that was deliberate and careful, "I didn't mean to." "I know," Harry said, though he didn't know what she'd done, exactly, only that whatever it was, it sat in his chest like it belonged there and didn't feel like a bad thing. Apollon stood up. She looked like a woman who needed to make several urgent international flu calls and was going to have to wait until she could do so politely. "Mr. Potter," she said, "where is your guardian?" Harry nodded back toward the apothecary where Petunia was still signing something. "Over there." Apollon nodded once, the way people nod when a plan is forming behind their eyes. "We will speak with her." She took Fleur's hand. Fleur came without protest, still looking at Harry, and they walked toward the apothecary. Harry followed. He wasn't sure why. He just knew that whatever had just settled in his chest would thin out if he walked in the other direction, and he was not, at 7 years old, in the habit of walking away from things that felt real. Petunia looked up from her clipboard when the three of them approached, and her expression cycled through surprise and the particular social discomfort of encountering a beautiful woman when you've always resented beauty, and then it landed on something else when Apollon said, "Mrs. Dursley? I believe something significant has just occurred between your nephew and my daughter, and we should discuss it." The ministry which looked between all of them with the alert interest of someone whose job has just become considerably more complicated. Petunia said, "What sort of significant?" "Veela significant," Apollon said. There was a pause during which the ministry witch's clipboard slowly lowered to her side. "I see," Petunia said, in the voice she used when she didn't see at all but intended to pretend she did until she could look something up. Harry sat down on the step of the apothecary, watching the alley, and let the warmth in his chest settle deeper, and thought that whatever happened next, something had fundamentally changed, and that was fine, because the thing it had replaced had never been great to begin with. The Delacours stayed in London for 4 days. Apollon spoke to Petunia with the practiced patience of someone who had explained something difficult many times to many different people, and Petunia listened with the focused attention of a woman confronting information she couldn't dismiss as superstition because a ministry official was sitting next to her confirming all of it. Vernon was called at his office and told, in brief, that certain developments had occurred and he was not, under any circumstances, to attempt to sort it out, a phrase Apollon used with a precision that suggested she knew exactly what manner of man Vernon Dursley was. The ministry whose name, Harry eventually established, was Arabella Figg, and who looked at him with the slightly haunted expression of someone who had been watching from a distance for years and feeling guilty about it, filed 17 different forms in 2 days. She also gave Harry a brief, unofficial explanation that sounded like it was intended to be reassuring and landed somewhere slightly more alarming. Veela claiming bonds are rare in someone this young, she said, in the garden of number 4, while Petunia was inside, and they're even rarer in non-Veela individuals. What it means practically is that the bond will strengthen over time and distance will feel uncomfortable, but you won't meet again until Hogwarts, so the bond will, she searched for a word, wait. Like something patient. Does it change anything? Harry asked. About me? Arabella Figg looked at him with those guilty eyes. It already has, hasn't it? He thought about the 3 weeks since the wig incident. The way everything had sharpened. The way the small, constant fear that lived in the background of every day at Privet Drive had quietly packed its bags and moved out, replaced by something steadier. The way Vernon's reddening face and rising voice now struck him as data to be processed rather than a storm to be survived. Yes, he said. The bond activates certain protections, she said carefully. In the mate. Particularly in a mate who needs them. She looked away, toward the fence, and he had the sense that she was choosing every word with extraordinary care. You're going to be all right, Harry. He looked at her. I was already going to be all right. She blinked. Then she smiled, and it was a real one, complicated and a little sad. Yes, she said. I'm starting to see that. The Delacours left on the 4th day. Fleur found Harry in the garden before they went. She came around the side of the house with the decisive air of someone who had slipped away from parental supervision on purpose, and stood in front of him with her chin up and her hands folded, looking like she'd prepared something to say. I looked it up, she announced. What happened? My grandmere has books. What did the book say? That I claimed you. She said it with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a fact they haven't decided how to feel about yet. I didn't mean to. She hesitated, and for the first time the careful composure cracked slightly. I was very upset. About leaving France. And then you were just there and you were she stopped. Very what? She looked at him for a moment with those pale eyes. Steady, she said finally, like it surprised her. You felt steady. Like a wall. Harry considered this. Being compared to a wall by a girl with silver hair in a French garden was probably not the most conventional compliment, but it sat well regardless. The books also say, Fleur continued, reclaiming her composure, that it can't be undone. I know. Are you angry? He thought about it genuinely, turning the question over. Was he angry? There was a warm certainty in his chest that had been there for 4 days now, and it was nothing like the tight, pressed-down knot that usually lived there. He'd woken up every morning of those 4 days without the first thought being about what he'd done wrong and what was going to happen to him. He'd eaten regularly. He'd slept without waking up at 3 in the morning with his heart hammering. No, he said. Are you? She considered it with the same gravity he'd given the question. Then, a little. But not at you. At the situation. At myself, maybe. For losing control. She said it with the precise French disdain of someone raised to consider control a virtue. Then she seemed to abandon the prepared speech entirely and said, more naturally, we will see each other at Hogwarts. In 4 years. Yes. I will be in 5th year when you are 1st year. I know. That's fine. She looked at him like she was trying to find the trap in that sentence and couldn't. Then something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, not yet, they were 7 and barely knew each other, but something like the beginning of respect. "Bon," she said. "Then I will see you in 4 years, 'Arry." "Harry," he corrected, gently. "'Arry," she said again, with complete deliberateness, and turned and walked away, and he could tell by the set of her shoulders that she knew exactly what she was doing. Harry watched her go. The warm certainty in his chest pulsed once, like a heartbeat syncing up. Then he went back inside to face Vernon, who had emerged from his office with the determined look of a man who intended to have a word, and faced him across the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his face perfectly still, and waited. Vernon got out 3 sentences and then seemed to run out of momentum. He'd never had that problem before. He looked at Harry with something new in his small eyes, not fear exactly, not yet, but its distant cousin, and said, "Well," and went to watch television. Harry made himself a sandwich and read the book Arabella Figg had quietly pressed into his hands before leaving. It was about accidental magic in young children, official ministry pamphlet material, technically educational. He finished it in an hour and went looking for more. The next 4 years were not a transformation. That was the key thing, the thing that nobody watching from the outside quite understood. Harry Potter did not transform. He did not become something different. He became more fully what he already was, stripped of the layers that had been sitting on top of him like wet clothing, too heavy, wrong-shaped, someone else's. He grew. He ate properly, because Petunia, operating under a new and apparently terror-based motivation following Fleur Delacour's visit, now fed him as she fed Dudley, meaning there was a period of approximately 3 months where he ate like he was making up for years of deficits, which he was. He put on height and muscle the way boys do when properly fueled, quickly and without fuss. He found the library. Not the school library, though that came later, because Arabella Figg quietly arranged for him to attend the local primary with something of a modified schedule, and the school library became a favorite haunt. But first, the public library on Magnolia Crescent, which was 8 minutes from Privet Drive and open until 6 on weekdays, and which contained, as it turned out, a remarkable amount of information about things that were almost magic if you read between the lines carefully enough. He read about history and mythology and the physical sciences and mathematics and, because he was thorough, he read fiction too, all the fantasy he could find, partly for the stories and partly because the magical world was real and he wanted to understand what the people around him had been trying to imagine about it. He developed opinions about which authors understood something true about power and which ones had gotten it comfortably wrong. He also practiced. Nothing dramatic. The ministry had left him with a clear understanding that unauthorized magic before age 11 would generate letters and possibly visits, and while he wasn't frightened of the visits, he saw no reason to invite them. But there was the other thing. The thing that the Veela bond had left behind, not magic, exactly, more like the magical equivalent of core strength. An awareness of the energy in his own body and in the air around him that he could sit with and work with and understand more clearly every year. He meditated. He learned. He figured things out. By 9, Vernon had stopped trying to have words with him entirely. Not because Harry threatened or argued or performed anything, he simply did not react to intimidation in any of the ways intimidation expected to be received, which robbed it of its function as completely as disconnecting a wire. Vernon's bluster needed an audience that was frightened or compliant, and Harry was neither, and eventually Vernon's brain, on some deep sublinguistic level, filed Harry under, not worth the effort, and moved on. By 10, Petunia occasionally spoke to him like a human being. Only occasionally. But occasionally was an upgrade. By 11, when the first Hogwarts letter arrived, Harry had already been expecting it for 6 months and had read everything he could find about the school through both Muggle and magical sources. Arabella Figg had, after his 3rd visit to her house asking careful questions, started lending him books with the resigned air of someone who had stopped being surprised by him. He read them all twice. He was ready. September 1st arrived with the specific chaotic energy of King's Cross at rush hour compounded by a hidden magical platform and several owls. Harry arrived alone, which was fine. He'd arranged it with Petunia, arranged, not asked, because asking implied a possibility of refusal that the situation didn't support, and he'd taken the tube with his trunk levitated carefully under an obscuring charm Arabella Figg had taught him as a parting gift, which was technically a gray area in the underage magic statutes and therefore not traceable. He found platform 9 3/4 without difficulty, watched for the first family to walk through the barrier with confidence, and followed. The train was red and loud and smelled of coal smoke and enthusiasm. Harry moved through the crowd on the platform with his trunk and Hedwig. He'd bought Hedwig himself, at Elop's, the week before, with money from his Gringotts vault that nobody at Privet Drive had known about because nobody at Privet Drive had thought to tell him he had won until Arabella mentioned it in passing last year, and he looked for a compartment that was either empty or contained someone interesting. Most of the occupied compartments contained people who were either already in established groups or performing a kind of social anxiety that he recognized and didn't want to get involved in. He found an empty one near the middle of the train and put his trunk on the rack and sat down and opened a book he'd been meaning to reread, and was 12 pages in when the door opened. The girl who looked in was small and bushy-haired and carrying a book of her own and wearing the expression of someone who had already knocked on 4 compartment doors and been made to feel unwelcome in all of them and had decided this one was the last attempt before she gave up and stood in the corridor. Harry looked up. "Is this compartment taken?" she asked, in a way that was trying to be casual and not quite achieving it. "Only by me," Harry said. "Sit down." She came in with a relief she was visibly trying not to show and sat down across from him and arranged herself and her book and then seemed to notice the title of his book. She looked at it. She looked at him. "That's a third-year charms theory text," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "We're first years." "I know." She opened her mouth, appeared to reconsider, and then said, "I've read that one. The section on ambient magic resonance is a bit speculative, I think. The author cites Malkin, but Malkin's later work revises some of those conclusions." Harry looked at her with genuine attention. "Which conclusion specifically?" She blinked like he'd surprised her. Then her whole face changed, the performed casualness dropping away into something much more alive, and she said, "The bit about wand channeling as a limiter rather than a conduit. Malkin's 1987 paper argues it's more complex than that the relationship is genuinely bidirectional, which," she stopped. "Sorry. I'm Hermione Granger." "Harry Potter." Her eyes went wide. Just briefly, she caught it and collected herself with impressive speed. "Oh," she said. "I've read about you. What did you think?" She considered the question seriously. "That the accounts were probably incomplete," she said. "The histories tend to overcorrect toward mythologizing, particularly when the subject is too young to contradict the narrative." Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I think we're going to get along fine," and went back to his book, and Hermione Granger opened hers, and they read in companionable silence for 20 minutes until the compartment door opened again. This time it was 2 boys, Weasley twins by the look of them, identical and delighted with themselves, who stuck their heads in and assessed the compartment's occupants with the specific evaluative look of people deciding if a situation was useful to them. "First years," the right one said. "Allegedly," Harry said, without looking up. There was a pause. Then the left one said, to the right one, "I like this one." Deeply, the right one agreed. "Fred Weasley," said one. "George Weasley," said the other. "Harry Potter, Hermione Granger," Harry said. "Come in or don't, but close the door either way." They came in, which was probably inevitable, and the compartment developed the pleasant atmosphere of people who were still figuring each other out but had already established that none of them were going to make it weird. Fred and George ate an enormous quantity of sweets and told stories about Hogwarts with the relish of people who genuinely loved the place, and Hermione absorbed information like she was going to be tested on it, and Harry listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention he'd been developing for 4 years, total, unhurried, and apparently bottomless. "You're very calm," George said eventually, around a chocolate frog. "For a first year heading to Hogwarts." "Should I not be?" Harry said. "Most first years are either terrified or performing not being terrified," Fred said. "Which is a different thing." "I've read everything available about the school," Harry said. "I know what's coming." "Everything available?" Hermione said, looking up from her note-taking. "Everything Muggle accessible and everything from a set of library books I've been borrowing for a year." He paused. "Plus some source material that was technically restricted but was lent to me informally." Hermione stared at him. "That's thorough," Harry supplied. "I was going to say impressive," she said, in the tone of someone who had not previously thought they would be saying that to a peer. "That too," Fred said, eating a Bertie Bott's bean and making a face. The train ate up the miles to Scotland. Outside the window the green of the Midlands gave way to something wilder and higher, and the quality of the light changed, and Harry watched it and felt the warmth in his chest that had been a constant companion for 4 years do something it hadn't done before. It pulled, slightly, in a direction. Westward, maybe. Or maybe it wasn't direction, exactly, more like the sense of a distance that had been stable for years beginning, very slowly, to close. Fleur was somewhere in the school. She'd started in September 2 years ago, according to Arabella's last letter, which had been carefully, innocently informational in the way that meant she'd actually been watching Harry's interest and deciding to be helpful. Fleur Delacour was in 3rd year at Beauxbatons and doing brilliantly, thank you for not asking. Harry hadn't asked because he'd known the answer would come if he was patient. He looked back at the book and turned a page, and the train moved north. The sorting was a practical matter. The sorting hat dropped onto his head and said, in a voice that seemed to come from inside his own skull, "Well. This is different." Harry waited. The hat seemed to be reading him the way he read things, thoroughly, without hurrying. Then it said, "4 years ago you were a starved, frightened child. You know that, yes?" Harry knew that. "And now you are," the hat seemed almost amused, "considerably more. For houses, each with a claim on some part of you. But the Veela bond has been doing something interesting to your core, and there's a house that suits not just your current nature but what you're becoming." "What house is that?" Harry thought. The hat laughed, which was a strange sensation. "Where do you think I'm going to put someone who spent 4 years in a library, walked into the magical world alone and calm at 11, and reads 3rd-year charms theory for fun?" Harry waited a beat, then thought, "Ravenclaw? You'd be comfortable there. But comfortable isn't quite what you need." The hat paused. "And Slytherin would use you, Gryffindor would love you, but, Gryffindor," the hat announced, and pulled the idea of cunning and patience and all of that from its voice and put something else in, something that sounded like it meant it. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry walked to it with measured steps and sat down, nodding at Hermione when she arrived, sorted Gryffindor, hat barely on her head for 2 seconds, and watched the rest of the ceremony with the attention he gave everything. He was aware, distantly, of the Slytherin table. Specifically of a girl with pale blonde hair, darker than Fleur's silver-white, almost platinum, who had been sorted to Slytherin 3 names before him and who, when he sat down at the Gryffindor table, looked across the hall at him with an expression he couldn't read at this distance but which had the quality of someone recognizing something unexpected. Daphne Greengrass, said something in his chest, not the warm Veela bond heat but something else, something quieter and newer, a low note under the main melody. He filed it away. He had years to figure out what it meant. The feast arrived. Harry ate with the focused pleasure of someone who had spent most of early childhood not eating enough and had never quite lost the appreciation that had left behind. Fred and George sat nearby and explained various Hogwarts customs with editorial commentary that was approximately 60% accurate and 40% creative, and Hermione sat next to Harry and whispered corrections, and it was easy and uncomplicated in a way that good things sometimes are at the start. Afterward, in the dormitory, when the other first-year boys were still talking in the overlapping voices of people burning off excitement, Harry lay in his four-poster and looked at the ceiling and put his hand over his chest, over the warmth, and felt it pulse steady and sure. He was here. He was 11 years old and he was himself, fully, for the first time in memory, and the place felt right in the particular way that places feel right when you've been moving toward them without knowing it. Something was going to happen tomorrow. And the day after, and for the years following. He could feel it the way you feel weather changing, not in any specific way but as a certainty, a pressure, a quality of the air. He closed his eyes. He slept without dreams. 3 days into term, potions happened. Severus Snape was, Harry had read, a complicated figure. He'd read the accounts that were available, partial, biased in both directions, heavy on the dramatic and light on the specific, and had formed the hypothesis that Snape was a brilliant man doing something he'd chosen and resented simultaneously, which produced a specific and unpleasant cocktail of behavior that Harry had seen in enough adults to recognize. What he hadn't expected was for Snape to open the class with theater. "Potter," Snape said, not looking up from taking attendance, but with the precise timing of someone who'd been planning it. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The class went quiet in the way classes go quiet when they sense something predatory. Harry looked at Snape with the same level attention he gave everything. "A sleeping draught," he said, "though more precisely you'd be producing what's called the draught of living death. Asphodel and wormwood both have properties that slow vital signs, and in combination at the right proportions they create something powerful enough to simulate death convincingly. The folklore name references that quality." He paused. "The exact proportions matter considerably. Wrong ratio and you get something that just puts the subject into a very unpleasant coma." Silence. Snape looked up from his register. His expression had done something complicated. It had expected an uninformed answer and hadn't received one, and was recalibrating around that, and didn't entirely appreciate having to. "Where would you look," Snape said, in a measured tone, "if I told you to find a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat," Harry said. "It's a calcified mass that acts as a broad antidote because of its absorbent properties. It's also found in some other livestock but goat is the most reliable source. They've been in medical use across both magical and muggle traditions since at least medieval times." Snape studied him. The class was very, very quiet. Hermione was staring at Harry with an expression split between admiration and what he suspected was the beginning of competitive frustration. "And what," Snape said, "is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "There isn't one," Harry said. "They're both names for aconitum. The plant is also called aconite. Different regional naming conventions for the same thing. It's a common source of confusion in early potion study because the naming inconsistency in the literature isn't flagged clearly enough." He considered. "Though I'd argue the more interesting question is about the concentration threshold at which it transitions from medicinal to poisonous, because that distinction is functionally important in a way that the naming question isn't." Snape was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a very different tone than Harry suspected he'd been intending to use, 5 points to Gryffindor. He moved on through attendance with the decisive air of a man who had been planning something and had abandoned the plan without explaining why. Harry went back to his notes. He felt Hermione's eyes on the side of his face for about 30 seconds before she also went back to her notes, making hers with approximately twice the intensity. He smiled at the parchment, where she couldn't see it. From the Slytherin side of the dungeon classroom, across the long central table, he was aware of pale platinum eyes watching him again. Daphne Greengrass, sitting with a dark-haired girl who was probably Pansy Parkinson, was watching him with an expression that was careful and measuring. Not hostile. Assessing. He didn't look at her directly. But he was aware of her the way he was aware of the low note, not invasive, not demanding. Just present. October arrived with the Scottish Highlands' particular brand of autumn weather, which was beautiful and extremely wet and occasionally horizontal. Harry spent most of his free time in the library, which Hermione had already claimed as her primary territory, and they developed a companionable working rhythm that didn't require much discussion. she brought things she wanted to cross-reference, he brought things he was working through, and they occupied the same table in the productive near silence of two people who were good at thinking and didn't feel the need to fill space. "Can I ask you something?" Hermione said one afternoon, about 6 weeks in, without looking up from her transfiguration notes. "Yes," Harry said. "Why do you know so much? And I don't mean that dismissively, I mean specifically. You came from a non-magical household. Your school records from primary education are normal, nothing exceptional. But you came here already knowing third-year charms theory and apparently all of potions, and I want to understand the mechanism." Harry turned a page. "I read everything I could find about the magical world starting when I was 7. Plus books borrowed from an acquaintance who works with the ministry. I had 4 years." He paused. "And the reading was motivated. By what?" He considered how much to say. Hermione was, he'd established this over 6 weeks of close observation, fundamentally honest, uncomfortable with incomplete information, and far better at keeping confidences than she appeared, because people assumed her talkativeness meant she disclosed everything, which was wrong. She disclosed what she'd decided was shareable and was quietly, completely reliable about the rest. "A magical bond," he said. "Nothing dangerous. But it changed things. In how I process information, how I approach problems." He kept his voice even. "Made some things clearer." She put her quill down and looked at him directly. "What kind of bond?" "Veela claiming bond." She stared. He watched her run through her knowledge base, which was extensive, he already knew that, and land on it. "Veela claiming bonds are extremely rare in non-Veela individuals," she said. "They typically only," she stopped. "How old were you?" 7. She processed this with the focused intensity of someone assembling a complicated picture. "And the bond is active? Intact?" "Yes." "To who?" "Someone I'll see again. Here, this year, I think, or next year possibly." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding whether this was her business, running the calculation, and arriving at the honest answer. "All right," she said, picking up her quill. "That explains the accelerated development. The bond would stimulate magical maturation. The reading and the study are still you, though." "Obviously," Harry said. She almost smiled. "I'm going to do some research on it." "I know," he said. "I assumed that was inevitable." She did smile then, quickly and genuinely, and went back to her notes. Harry looked at the window, where October rain was doing something dramatic and horizontal against the glass, and felt the warmth in his chest that had been steady for 4 years give a distinct, purposeful pulse, like something waking up. He put a hand over his sternum, not thinking about it, and felt it echo back. Close, now. Whatever was going to happen between him and Fleur, the bond knew it was close, and was preparing for it in whatever way bonds prepared for things, which apparently involved making him more aware of everything, sharper, warmer, more present. He was 11 years old and he was patient, and the world was opening like a book he'd been waiting to read properly. He turned a page. The Halloween troll was, in retrospect, less of a disaster than it could have been. The way it usually went, Harry had read enough accounts that leaked into magical community gossip, through Arabella and through the historical texts, was confusion, miscommunication, a chase through corridors, and 3 11-year-olds who should not have been fighting trolls, fighting a troll. What actually happened was different, because Harry was different. He heard Quirrell's announcement about the troll in the dungeon during the feast and was on his feet before most people had finished registering it, and he was thinking about 2 things simultaneously. One was the standard tactical question of where in the dungeon a mountain troll would logically move given its known behavioral patterns: lumbering, attracted to noise, heat-seeking to some degree. And the other was that Hermione had left the feast nearly an hour ago, upset, because Ron Weasley had said something unkind about her in the corridor and she hadn't come back. He was already moving toward the bathroom corridor before the prefect started organizing people, because the troll was not, he was fairly certain, in the dungeon. It had gotten further than that, which meant the dungeon announcement was either wrong or late, and Hermione's usual misery destination was the first-floor girls' bathroom. Fred and George fell into step beside him with the instinctive competence of people who had grown up around a lot of magical emergency and learned to move toward rather than away. "You know where the troll is," George said. "Educated guess." "Good enough. Plan? Get Hermione out of the bathroom and away from the troll. If we can't get her out first, distract it until we can." Fred produced his wand. "We should mention," he said conversationally, "that we have technically done some unauthorized research on immobilization jinxes." "Good," Harry said. "How do they work?" Fred explained very quickly. Harry listened, filed it, and moved. The bathroom corridor was on the first floor, and they could hear the troll before they could see it, the sound of something enormous moving without concern for anything in its path, stone cracking under its feet. It had already passed the bathroom entrance by the time they got there. Harry looked at the bathroom door and listened and heard, from inside, no sound. He pushed it open. Hermione was standing against the far wall, between the sinks and the door, and she had clearly heard the troll in the corridor and made a decision that turned out to be the wrong one. She'd hidden in the bathroom stall rather than run, and now the stall door was in pieces on the floor because the troll had swung its club through the wall while still in the corridor, apparently attracted to the echo inside. She was white. Not panicked exactly, he watched her face and saw someone who was frightened and thinking at the same time, which was something. It was actually something. She was very good under pressure even when she was terrified. "Out," Harry said. "Now. Toward me." She came. She moved fast and he caught her arm and turned her toward the door, and behind them the troll turned to follow, but it was big and the bathroom doorway was not built for 12-foot mountain trolls. It tried anyway. The doorway exploded outward in a shower of stone. Harry had already pulled Hermione clear, and Fred and George were 10 feet down the corridor, and Harry turned to face the troll, which had gotten most of its upper body through the wall now and was regarding them with the slow, certain interest of something very large that was also very stupid. Harry looked at it. He felt the clean, still focus that had been growing in him for 4 years settle into place, the thing that wasn't quite magic and wasn't quite just calm but was both, the thing the Veela bond had put in him like a tuning fork struck against the right note. He raised his wand. Wingardium Leviosa. Not the club. Not the obvious target that every account suggested. The club weighed several hundred kilograms and throwing it around a corridor would cause more damage than the troll. Harry targeted the troll's foot, specifically the ankle, the small of the leverage point, and put the lift on it sharply and hard. The troll went over. All 12 feet of it, ankle caught by the levitation charm, the body following the physics. It hit the corridor floor with an impact that Harry felt in his back teeth, and the corridor filled with dust and the sound of stone cracking under the impact, and then there was the troll, prone, momentarily stunned, and Harry turned to Fred and George. "Now would be the time for the unauthorized immobilization jinx," he said. Both of them hit it simultaneously and with feeling. The troll stopped moving. Professors McGonagall and Snape arrived approximately 45 seconds later, running, to find 3 first-year students and 1 unconscious mountain troll in a corridor that had recently lost a significant structural element, and the 3 first-year students all looked at them with varying degrees of composure. McGonagall's face went through several transformations. "What," she said, in a voice like ice, "happened here?" "The troll came through the wall," Harry said, which suggested it had been in the corridor for some time before we arrived. "We heard Hermione hadn't returned to the feast and came to find her." He looked at McGonagall directly. Fred and George Weasley used an immobilization jinx. It was effective. McGonagall looked at the Weasley twins, who were doing their best to look simultaneously innocent and heroic. "I toppled it with Wingardium Leviosa," Harry added. "The ankle, not the club. Reduced collateral impact." Snape was looking at Harry with an expression that was hard to parse, but if he'd had to label it, Harry would have said it was something close to reluctant recalibration. McGonagall took a very controlled breath. "Granger. Are you hurt?" "No, Professor," Hermione said. She looked steadier than she had in the bathroom, the terror burning off into the slightly elevated heart rate of someone who had been through something and was processing it at speed. She was also, Harry noticed, standing about a half-step closer to him than she'd been a minute ago, which was either conscious or not, but was probably worth knowing. 5 points to Gryffindor, McGonagall said, in a tone that clearly meant, I will be returning to this later and it will involve a much longer conversation. For the immobilization. And, she looked at Harry, at the troll, at the corridor, effective defensive application of a first-year charm. She didn't take points for being out of the feast, which Harry noted and filed. The warmth in his chest pulsed, steady and sure, and he exhaled through his nose and put his wand away. Hermione looked at him as they walked back toward the tower, McGonagall's hand on her shoulder steering her firmly, and said, quietly, not for anyone else, thank you. You were already thinking your way out of it, Harry said. I just shortened the timeline. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was different, not the careful intellectual assessment she usually gave him, something less measured and more instinctive. Then she looked away and matched McGonagall's pace, and Harry walked behind them, and the warm note in his chest that had been Fleur's since he was 7 was exactly as present as always. But underneath it, so quiet it was almost not there, the new note had grown a little louder. Chapter 2, Arrivals. The thing about Hogwarts in winter was that the castle itself seemed to lean into it. The stones held the cold differently than they held the warmth, actively, almost deliberately, and the corridors near the outer walls developed their own microclimates that the older students navigated by instinct, cutting through certain archways and avoiding others in patterns that looked random until you understood the logic. Harry understood the logic by mid-November. He'd mapped the castle the way he mapped everything, methodically, without making a production of it, walking routes at different times of day and noting temperature, traffic, which staircases moved when and where they tended to end up. The map existed in a small notebook he kept in his inside robe pocket, annotated in his own compressed shorthand. It wasn't complete yet. It would take years to be complete, and some parts of it would always be provisional because the castle itself was provisional, fundamentally alive in some way that resisted final documentation. He was fine with that. Provisional was honest. The Quidditch pitch was where he was on a Tuesday morning in mid-November when he probably should have been at breakfast, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets watching the Gryffindor team practice, because McGonagall had cornered him the previous Thursday to tell him, in the direct way she had, that he'd made the team. Not as a reserve. As seeker. First year, which was unprecedented enough that she'd mentioned it twice, apparently feeling the significance warranted emphasis. Harry had asked the practical questions, practice schedule, equipment situation, match timing, and thanked her and gone back to what he'd been doing, and McGonagall had watched him leave with an expression that Fred later described, when Harry relayed the conversation, as McGonagall's version of delighted, which looks from the outside like moderately less disapproval than usual. The practice was fine. Oliver Wood was exactly as intense as his reputation suggested. Harry had done the research, naturally, but intensity that was about genuine love of the sport was a different animal than intensity that was about control, and Harry didn't mind the first kind. He listened to Wood's tactical briefings with the quality of attention Wood had probably never received from a first-year student, and Wood had responded to that attention by forgetting, approximately 40 minutes in, that Harry was a first year at all, and talking to him like a peer, which Harry appreciated. What Harry was currently doing, standing at the field edge instead of eating breakfast, was thinking about something Flitwick had said in Charms the previous day. They'd been covering the foundations of summoning theory, not the spell itself, that was third year, but Flitwick, who had a sharp eye for students who were ahead, had given Harry a secondary text with a note attached that said simply, for when you finished the primary. Harry had finished the primary in October. The secondary text had a chapter on resonance bonds, magical connections between objects, between places, between people, and how they amplified spell work when both parties were casting. It was an academic text, theoretical, not intended as a practical guide, and the author had clearly never had a Veela-claiming bond to study, but reading between the careful academic lines, Harry had started to understand something about what the warmth in his chest actually was. It wasn't passive. It had never been passive. He'd been treating it as something that happened to him, a gift, a change in circumstance, beneficial but external. The text was suggesting something different. That a resonance bond was a mutual structure, that both parties were active participants in it even without knowing it, and that the longer the bond was held at distance, the more it built. He turned this over. For years at distance. The bond building without release. And now, the warmth pulsed, and his hand went to his sternum before he thought to stop it. "That's the third time I've seen you do that this week," said a voice from approximately 2 feet behind him. Harry turned. Hermione was standing on the path from the castle, wrapped in scarf and gloves, holding 2 pieces of toast, and looking at him with the focused curiosity she aimed at things she wanted to understand. He hadn't heard her approach. That was notable, he heard most things. She held out one of the pieces of toast. He took it. They stood side by side looking at the Quidditch team circling overhead in the grey November morning, and Harry ate his toast. "The hand on the chest thing," she clarified, as if he'd forgotten the question. "I'm aware," Harry said. "Is it the bond?" "Probably." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been researching it. Veela claiming bonds. There's not a lot in the library, but there's enough." She paused. "The claiming mark, the initial transfer of intent, which in your case would have been entirely accidental, Veela children don't have control before puberty, it catalyzes something in the mate. Something about the magical core." She turned to look at him. "Something that shouldn't be possible in someone without Veela heritage." "I know," Harry said. "It doesn't bother you that it changed you?" He considered this honestly, because she deserved honesty and he'd known that about her since September. "The thing it changed was something that needed changing," he said. "I was, before. When I was 7. He paused. "There were reasons I needed protecting. The bond provided them." He shrugged, a small economical movement. "I'm not the same person I would have been without it, but I was never going to be that person anyway. Life doesn't work like that." Hermione was quiet for a moment, and he could hear her turning this over, examining it from several angles. "That's a remarkably non-anxious way to think about something that fundamentally altered your development," she said. "Would you prefer I be anxious about it?" "No," she said, with unusual immediacy. Then she seemed to notice the immediacy and recalibrated. "I mean, no, obviously not. I just expected more." She trailed off. "Distress? Ambivalence, maybe. I'll work up some if it would make you more comfortable," Harry said. She looked at him sharply and then registered the tone and laughed, a genuine one, short and a little surprised. "Don't bother," she said. Then, more quietly, "The research also says that powerful bonds can have secondary effects on people proximate to the primary mate." She said this in the most carefully neutral voice he'd heard from her, which meant she was being deliberately careful. "Effects that the literature calls sympathetic resonance." Harry looked at her. She was looking at the Quidditch team, her profile steady, her toast half-eaten. Her jaw was doing the thing it did when she was holding something still that wanted to move. "What does sympathetic resonance feel like?" he asked. "The texts describe it differently depending on the source," she said. "Some say it presents as unusual attentiveness. Heightened awareness of the primary mate's location and state. A kind of," she stopped. "A pull. For lack of a better word." Harry said nothing. "I'm not saying that's what's happening," she added, still not looking at him. "I'm saying the research exists and it's interesting and I thought you should know." "Thank you," he said. She finally looked at him. "You're not surprised?" "No." She absorbed this. Right, she said. Then she finished her toast with great focus, turned on her heel, and walked back toward the castle, and Harry watched her go with the quality of attention she'd probably been trying not to notice she provoked, and turned back to the Quidditch pitch. The low note in his chest, the Hermione note, he'd started calling it that, privately, without quite deciding to, was warm and steady. He watched Oliver Wood run the team through a formation drill and thought about resonance bonds and what it meant that one could have secondaries, and whether Fleur knew, and whether it mattered, and when everything was going to arrive in the same place at the same time. Soon, probably. That was the overall shape of things. Soon. The Quidditch match against Slytherin was on a Saturday in late November, and the whole school turned out in the particular way schools turn out for things when the weather is just miserable enough to make the sacrifice feel meaningful. Harry sat on his broom, a Nimbus 2000, because McGonagall had arranged a school broom on the basis that the team's seeker needed competitive equipment, and Harry had accepted without performing false modesty about it, and felt the cold cut through his Quidditch robes with the brisk efficiency of Scottish November at altitude, and he looked at the pitch below and the crowd in the stands and felt, simply, good. He liked flying. He'd known he would, because the few accounts of his father he'd managed to find suggested it was genetic, and the theory of the levitation charm and allied air movement magic had always clicked with him in a particular intuitive way. But knowing you'll like something and then actually doing it for the first time at age 11 on a Nimbus 2000 with the whole school watching were two different categories of good, and he'd let himself enjoy the distinction without performing nonchalance about it. The match started. Oliver ran the tactical plan they'd drilled, the chasers moving in the three-formation pattern Wood called the Hawk's Head, and Harry moved to the high midfield position and watched everything, the game, the crowd, the sky, all of it at once, because the snitch was going to be wherever it was and he wasn't going to miss it by watching only one thing. He was also, with a portion of his attention, aware of something strange happening with his broom. Not mechanical failure, nothing as obvious as that. More like interference. A subtle wrongness in the response, the way the broom wanted to throw him at irregular intervals, not with the consistency of a fault in the wood but with the irregularity of something external. He felt it in his hands and in his core, and he noted it without reacting to it, because reacting was what it wanted. Something was jinxing his broom. He scanned the stands, not obviously, just a sweep of attention that looked like a seeker watching for the snitch. He identified 3 separate clusters of people who were watching him more than the match. Most of them were innocent, the standard elevated attention of spectators tracking the seeker. But one, in the teacher's row, a figure in robes who was muttering almost constantly and whose eyes hadn't left him since the match started. Quirrell. Harry filed this information with the flat precision of someone who had suspected something about Quirrell since term started and was now receiving confirmation. The stutter, the smell of garlic, the specific quality of wrongness that the man projected, Harry had no proof, but proof and suspicion were separate categories, and suspicion had its own value. He kept flying. He let the broom buck under him and counteracted it with core strength and adjusted grip without making it look effortful, because whatever Quirrell was doing required concentration, and the best response to someone concentrating on a specific effect was to make the effect look like it wasn't working. He spotted the snitch 17 minutes in, gold glint near the Slytherin goalposts, about 40 feet out, and went for it without hesitation, broom fighting him the whole way, and he turned the fight into a resource, let the unpredictability of the broom's movement make his own trajectory harder to predict, and came out of a downward spiral with his hand closed around gold and the crowd making the kind of sound that didn't need translation. He landed and opened his hand, looked at the snitch, and looked up at the teacher's row. Quirrell had stopped muttering. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was hard to read from this distance but had the quality of someone revising an assessment. Harry pocketed the snitch and walked toward Wood, who was somewhere between tears and a religious experience, and the team closed around him in a wave of noise and celebration that he accepted with good grace. He said nothing about the jinx. Not yet. He had no proof, and making claims without proof was the kind of thing that invited the wrong kind of attention. But he was watching Quirrell from this point on with a different quality of attention, the kind he gave things that were actually dangerous rather than things that were merely difficult. Hermione found him in the celebration crowd afterward, fighting through the jubilant press of Gryffindors with the determined air of someone with a purpose, and she grabbed his arm and pulled him slightly aside and said, "Your broom was being jinxed." "I know," Harry said. She stared at him. "You know. You knew during the match?" "Yes." "And you, Harry, you should have landed, you should have called a foul, you should have." "By whom?" Harry said. "I had no proof. I had a suspicion." Landing mid-match on a suspicion gives whoever is doing it exactly what they want. He looked at her steadily. "I handled it." She stared at him for another moment, the frustration and the concern and the reluctant acknowledgement that he was probably right all visible in the working of her expression. "Fine," she said. "But next time tell me before the match so I can counter-curse from the stands." Harry looked at her. "Can you do that?" "I can learn to," she said, with complete confidence, and turned to push back through the crowd. Harry watched her go, and the low warm note in his chest went up half a step, and he thought, right. December arrived, and then Christmas, and most of the school went home. Harry stayed. He'd told Petunia he wouldn't be returning for the holidays, and Petunia had responded with a letter that was 2 sentences long and entirely free of protest, and that was that. Fred and George stayed too, ostensibly because they wanted to enjoy the castle at Christmas but realistically because the Hogwarts kitchen was significantly more generous than their mother during revision period, and Ron Weasley, who had been a peripheral figure in Harry's term, occasional meals together, the odd chess game, stayed as well. On Christmas morning Harry woke to a pile of presents at the foot of his bed, which was unexpected. A chocolate frog assortment from Fred and George. A book on advanced seeker techniques from McGonagall, wrapped without a card but in tartan paper that was unmistakably specific. Something from Hermione, she'd gone home for Christmas but had left it before she went, which turned out to be a copy of Malkin's 1987 paper on wand channeling, apparently obtained through the Hogwarts library's interinstitutional request system, annotated in the margins in her small precise handwriting with her own observations and counterpoints. Harry sat with this for a moment. She'd done actual academic work to give him a present. He turned a page and read one of her margin notes. The bidirectionality argument holds here but Malkin doesn't account for the role of intent, which seems like a significant omission, and felt something simple and clear. And then there was a package he didn't recognize. No card. Soft, when he pressed it, like fabric. He opened it and found what was clearly a cloak, silvery, weightless, the material moving between his fingers like water, and a small note in a narrow, old-fashioned hand that said, "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is yours. Use it well." Harry put the cloak on. He disappeared. He looked at his hands, or rather at the space where his hands were, and felt the magic of it settle around him, old magic, very old, something structural in the weave that was nothing like a simple disillusionment, and thought about James Potter, who had left this cloak with someone and never come back for it, and felt something complicated and quiet for exactly long enough to feel it properly. Then he took it off, folded it carefully, and put it at the bottom of his trunk under the locked compartment. He used it that night. The library, restricted section, he had a mental list of 6 texts in the restricted section he wanted to read, and the cloak made this straightforwardly achievable. He was thorough and quick and left everything exactly as he found it. He was nearly back to the dormitory when he turned a corner and found the mirror. It was enormous, framed in gold, and it was standing in an empty classroom with the casual impermanence of something that had been moved and might be moved again, and Harry looked at it and the inscription along the top registered, "Erist stra eru oit uba kafru oit on wosi." He knew what this was. He'd read about it. Mirror of Erist, one-way desire reflection, showed the viewer what they most wanted. Dumbledore had written about it in passing in a theoretical paper Harry had found in the restricted section just now. He stood in front of it. What he saw was not what he expected. He'd expected James and Lily, and they were there, a man with messy black hair and glasses who looked like him grown up, a woman with red hair and green eyes who looked at him from the mirror with an expression of such specific maternal recognition that he had to breathe deliberately. They were there. But standing next to him in the mirror was also Fleur, older than he'd ever seen her, 17 maybe, silver hair and pale eyes, and she was turned toward him with her hand on his arm, and next to her, shadows in the glass that he couldn't quite resolve, were other figures, warm presences without clear faces, and what he felt looking at all of it was not yearning or grief but something that felt like direction. He stood in front of the mirror for 3 minutes. Then he turned and walked away, and he didn't come back to it. Wanting a thing was fine. But standing in front of a reflection of it wasn't the same as building toward it, and he had work to do. January brought term back with full force, and with it, oddly, Daphne Greengrass. Oddly not because she appeared, she'd been present all term, they shared 2 classes, he was aware of her as he was aware of all things in his orbit, but because in January, she started looking at him differently. Less assessing, more direct. Like she'd been watching long enough to form a conclusion and was now operating from it. He noticed her noticing him during a potions class in mid-January. Snape had them working on a basic calming draft, paired work, and Harry was paired with Neville Longbottom, who was anxious and capable in complicated inverse proportion to one another and who Harry had made a deliberate project of since September, because Neville's hands were steadier than he knew when someone else in the room was calm and sure. Stir counterclockwise, Harry said quietly, not clockwise, the lavender oil won't emulsify until you reverse. Neville reversed. The potion shifted from sickly green to something approaching the pale silver it was supposed to be, and Neville's shoulders dropped 2 inches with relief. How did you? Neville started. The oil was sitting on top. Clockwise motion keeps it separate. Counterclockwise folds it in. Harry watched the color. For more rotations, then let it rest. Neville did exactly this and the potion resolved to a clean silver that Snape, passing their bench, looked at and then looked at Harry with and said nothing, but added a mark to his register in what Harry had learned to read as the column for competent. When he looked up from the cauldron, Daphne was watching him from 3 benches over. Her own potion was perfect, she was, he'd established, genuinely skilled in potions and didn't rely on it being subtle, but she was watching Harry and Neville with an expression that wasn't competitive. It was something more like recognition. He held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away, which he noted, because most people looked away first. Then she looked back at her cauldron and made an adjustment that was technically unnecessary but demonstrated she'd been paying attention to the same information he'd given Neville. That was interesting. The low note in his chest, it had been a constant since October, and he'd gotten used to it the way you get used to the particular frequency of a place you live in, present and structurally familiar, shifted slightly. Not louder. More textured. He didn't examine it in class. He finished the potion, graded it against the instructions, found it 3% above specification on potency, which was as much as he'd aimed for, and cleaned his workspace. Outside class, in the corridor, Daphne fell into step beside him with the deliberate casualness of someone who had timed it and didn't want that to be obvious. You helped Longbottom, she said. I was paired with him, Harry said. Paired with him, yes. You could have let him fail and taken the individual credit. Most people do. Most people are thinking about the wrong thing. She looked at him sideways. She had gray eyes, very light, with a quality of precision in them like well-maintained tools. What are you thinking about? The potion, Harry said. Making it correct. And Longbottom? He was preventing it from being correct. Helping him was the most direct solution. A pause. They were walking toward the stairs that led up from the dungeons, and the corridor was thinning as students branched off. That's a very pragmatic answer, Daphne said. Most people would have given me the charitable one. The pragmatic answer is the charitable one, Harry said. Helping Neville succeed costs me nothing and means he leaves class having done something right, which he needs more than I need individual credit. Daphne was quiet for a few steps. Then, Greengrass, she said. Daphne. I know, Harry said. Potter. I know, she said, with a slight inflection that meant, obviously. They reached the stairs. She went right, toward the Slytherin common room route. He went left, toward Gryffindor. She didn't look back, but he felt the brief, specific attention of someone deliberately not looking back. The low note shifted again, and this time it definitely got a fraction louder, and Harry climbed the stairs and thought about resonance bonds and secondary effects and the way some things built gradually and then arrived all at once. Spring came in the reluctant Scottish way, technically present but not willing to commit, and Harry turned 12 in a castle that felt more like home every week. He got a card from Hermione, who had remembered without being told. A note from Hagrid, who had pressed it into his hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting all year to give it, containing an invitation to tea that Harry accepted because Hagrid was genuine in a way he valued and because the hut at the edge of the grounds contained, he was certain, useful information about the school's history. He was right. Hagrid knew things about Hogwarts that weren't in any book, not because the books hadn't tried but because some knowledge was carried in people rather than pages, in the memory of someone who had lived somewhere for 30 years and noticed things. Harry listened to Hagrid talk about the school the way he listened to everything, totally, with appreciation, and asked questions that Hagrid answered with increasing pleasure, because Hagrid loved the school and he loved being asked about it. The conversation also, eventually, got around to the third-floor corridor. Not because Harry pushed it there, he let it arrive naturally, following the current of Hagrid's storytelling, and Hagrid mentioned it in passing and then immediately changed the subject, which was more informative than if he'd discussed it directly. The mirror of Erupt had been moved there, Harry was fairly sure. He'd established as much by elimination. Dumbledore had written about moving objects, beneath the dog and beyond the trials, a phrase from a theoretical paper that was now reading as considerably less theoretical. The mirror and whatever else was down there were protecting something specific. The warmth and structure of the magical containment he'd felt near the third-floor corridor on 3 separate reconnaissance walks told him the protections were collaborative, multiple magical signatures, multiple hands, and the only thing that warranted that kind of collaborative protection was something extraordinarily valuable or extraordinarily dangerous. He had a hypothesis about what it was. He was keeping the hypothesis provisional. What he was not doing was investigating alone at speed, because alone and at speed was how you made irreversible mistakes. Hagrid, he said, over tea, what lives under a giant 3-headed dog, if someone needed to know for research purposes. Hagrid went very still in the particular way of large men trying to look casual. What makes you ask that? Research, Harry said pleasantly. Harry, Hagrid said, with the specific pained affection of someone who knew he'd already said too much, some things are best left alone. I agree, Harry said. I'm not planning to go anywhere. I'm planning to understand what I'm dealing with. Hagrid's large forehead creased. You sound too calm about things what should worry a normal person. I know, Harry said. I'm working on it. Hagrid laughed, despite himself, a rumbling giant's laugh that rattled the teacups. You are a strange kid, Harry. I've heard that, Harry said, and drank his tea. April brought the end-of-year surge, exams approaching on the horizon like weather, and with them a particular conversation that Harry had been expecting since October. Hermione found him in the library at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, later than either of them usually stayed, and she sat down across from him and put a book on the table between them with the air of someone who had made a decision on the way here. The book was Resonance Bonds and Their Complications, by Ilara Voss, published by the Obscurus Books imprint, clearly taken from the restricted section, and the section she'd opened it to had a chapter heading that read, Secondary Bonds in Veela Claimed Individuals, a Theoretical and Historical Survey. All right, Harry said. All right, she said, as if he'd challenged her. I've been researching this since November and I want to be clear that my interest is entirely academic and the fact that, she stopped. Breathed. The chapter says secondary bonds typically present a sympathetic resonance in individuals with strong magical cores who are proximate to the primary bond. The pull is unidirectional until the primary mate activates, at which point, she stopped again. Harry waited. It says the secondary bond candidates are typically 3, she said, very carefully. 4 primary mates of sufficient magical power. 3 individuals, identified by the bond, not by choice. I know, Harry said. Hermione looked at him. You know. I've read the same material. And you're, she opened and closed her hands, fine with this? I don't know if I'm fine with it, Harry said honestly. I haven't decided. But I'm not frightened of it, which is different from being fine. He looked at her directly. Are you frightened of it? The answer took a moment. She had both hands flat on the table now, the way she sat when she needed to stay very still. It feels large, she said. The idea that there's a magical reason for, she stopped again. For what you're feeling? Harry said. Hermione looked at the table. Then at him. Yes. Harry held her gaze. Does it bother you more that there might be a magical reason, or that you're feeling it regardless? She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said, and it was so clearly true. Hermione, who always knew, genuinely not knowing, that something in Harry went careful and gentle. Then we don't have to decide anything now, he said. She exhaled. It sounded like something releasing. Right, she said. Yes. That's right. She closed the book and put it in her bag and pulled out her charms revision with the decisive air of someone changing subjects. The charms exam is going to have at least 1 question on ambient magic theory, I'm almost certain. Probably 2, Harry said, and they revised in the warm library quiet, and the low note in his chest was steady and full, and neither of them mentioned the book again that night, but the conversation had happened and its shape remained. The end of year arrived faster than the beginning had. The business with Quirrell and the mirror and the philosopher's stone happened in a rush that Harry had seen the edges of coming for months. He'd put it together in early May, the dog on the 3rd floor, Snape's leg, Quirrell's increasingly distracted presence, the pattern of small magical events around the corridor that read, to someone who'd been paying attention, like a system being tested. He'd gone down on a Tuesday night with the invisibility cloak when the pattern said someone was going to make a move, and he'd been right. The trials were interesting. He moved through them with the efficiency of someone who had pre-solved most of the problems theoretically and found the reality mostly consistent with the theory. The devil's snare required light and calm. The key required 3-dimensional thinking. The chess was straightforward if you thought about it as a problem in spatial positioning rather than a game. The potion logic, he'd read Snape's handwriting style enough to recognize the structure of the riddle, took 30 seconds. He walked through the final door alone, because he'd sent Hermione back from the chess room. She'd argued, briefly and intensely, and he'd said, if I don't come back in an hour, go to Dumbledore's office and tell him everything, and she'd looked at him for a long moment with something fierce and scared and real in her face, and then she'd nodded and gone. Quirrell was there. Voldemort was there, in the way a parasite is there. The mirror was there. Harry looked at Quirrell and felt no fear. He hadn't realized until this moment how true that was. He felt the clean, focus still of the thing the bond had given him, the steady-as-a-wall quality that Fleur had named at 7 years old in Diagon Alley, and he looked at Quirrell and looked at the mirror and thought clearly. Quirrell wanted the stone from the mirror. He couldn't get it because he wanted to use it. Harry understood this because he'd read Dumbledore's theoretical work on erupt. The mirror would only give the stone to someone who wanted to find it but not use it. He didn't want to use the stone. He wanted Quirrell to not have it. Those were different things. He walked to the mirror. He saw himself in it, older, standing with Fleur and others he still couldn't resolve clearly, and he felt something drop into his pocket. Small. Round. Warm. He turned to Quirrell with both hands at his sides. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. Quirrell touched him and burned, the old protection, Lily's protection, his mother's love made structural in his skin, and Harry didn't flinch from it. He held on. He held on with the steady, certain purpose of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why, and Quirrell came apart in the way that things come apart when the magic holding them together is withdrawn, and the voice of Voldemort tore through the room like something that had not yet learned it had lost. It was an ending. Or rather, a postponement. Harry lay on the stone floor afterward, looking at the ceiling, and felt the warmth in his chest pulse with a frequency he hadn't felt before, deeper, more urgent. Like something responding to proximity. He passed out. He woke up in the hospital wing to Hermione's voice. She was arguing with someone, Pomfrey, probably, given the tone, about the acceptable visiting hours for students who had been magically recovered in the last 6 hours, and Pomfrey was holding firm, and Hermione was making the case with the intensity of a barrister who had the law on her side and intended everyone to know it. Harry turned his head and said, "Let her in." Pomfrey looked at him with the specific exasperation of a healer whose patient had just undermined a perfectly reasonable institutional policy. Then she sighed and stepped aside, and Hermione came through the door and stopped at the foot of his bed and looked at him with an expression that was intensely controlled over something that was not controlled at all. "You're all right," she said. "More or less," he said. She came to the chair beside his bed and sat down and put her hands in her lap. "You should have let me come. You'd have been hurt. You were hurt." "Less than I would have been with someone to protect," Harry said. Her jaw tightened. "I can protect myself." "I know that," Harry said. "That's not what I said." She looked at him. Something in her face went through several changes. Then she said, very quietly, "Don't do that again. Not without telling me first." He held her gaze. "All right. Promise me." "I promise," he said, meaning it, because a promise to Hermione Granger was not something to make casually and he wasn't being casual. "If something like this happens again, I'll tell you first." She exhaled. Her hands, in her lap, were no longer as tightly held. She looked at the window, where the afternoon light was coming through soft and gold, and Harry watched her profile and felt the low note in his chest do something it hadn't done before. It harmonized. Not with the Fleur warmth, not competing with it, but alongside it, like two instruments in the same piece. He was 12 years old and he had just survived Voldemort and he was watching Hermione Granger look out a hospital window in the quiet specific way of someone who was feeling more than they'd decided to say. "The end-of-term feast is tonight," she said eventually. "I'll be there," he said. "Dumbledore's going to make a speech." "Probably." "Gryffindor won the House Cup," she said. "He's going to give us last-minute points, I think." She gestured at him. "Don't need them," Harry said. "I know," she said. "But it's tradition." He smiled, and she caught it and looked at him with something open and unguarded for just a moment before she looked away again and straightened in her chair and became Hermione again, competent, composed, ready. But the moment had been there. He'd felt it. She had too. He looked at the ceiling and felt the warmth pulse and thought, 1 year down. The summer waited, and then the years beyond it, and Fleur Delacour was somewhere in France growing into herself and her bond, and Daphne Greengrass was somewhere in the castle making her own calculations, and something was building in the deep architecture of Harry's magic like a storm composing itself out of clear sky. He closed his eyes. Outside the window, the Scottish evening came in gold and slow, and the castle breathed around him, and Harry Potter lay in the hospital wing and let himself be still and said nothing to anyone about the small, smooth weight in his pocket that should have been with Dumbledore already but had, inexplicably, stubbornly, chosen not to leave his hand. Chapter 3. The Pull's second year arrived with a flying car and a broken wrist and a basilisk, and Harry handled all three with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was total and unhurried and slightly unnerving to anyone watching from the outside. The flying car was Ron's idea, Ron Weasley, who had become a genuine friend over the previous year in the gradual way that friendships form between people who are thrown together repeatedly and find, over time, that they like who they're becoming around each other. The barrier at King's Cross had sealed itself, for reasons Harry didn't yet have the full picture on, and Ron's solution was immediate and enthusiastic and approximately 40% thought through. Harry had gotten into the car because he'd weighed the alternatives, miss the train, arrive at Hogwarts late, explain to Dumbledore why, deal with whatever had sealed the barrier and whether it was targeted, and decided that the car, stupid as it was the most direct solution. Ron flew badly, mostly because Ron flew as he did everything when anxious, which was with enormous energy and intermittent technical competence, and Harry sat in the passenger seat and watched the motorway unfold below them and said nothing about the wobbling altitude because Ron was already handling enough. They arrived at Hogwarts. They crashed into the Whomping Willow, which Harry had been watching approach for 30 seconds with the particular feeling of a person who can see what's about to happen and has assessed the exit routes. He'd braced correctly and come out with a bruised shoulder and, when the tree's branch caught the door at exactly the wrong angle, a crack in his right wrist that he identified immediately from the specific quality of the pain. "My wrist," he said. Ron was upside down, disentangling himself from the steering column. "Are you broken, I think?" "Not badly." Harry looked at the tree, which was winding up for another swing, and said, "We need to move now," and they moved. Snape found them on the grounds. He found them the way Snape found things he was looking for, with the precise timing of someone who had already prepared a response to a situation he'd anticipated with something approaching pleasure. The lecture that followed was delivered in the particular tone Snape reserved for maximum theatrical impact, and Harry listened to it with his broken wrist held carefully at his side and his face neutral, and when Snape finished, Harry said, "I'll need to go to the hospital wing for my wrist." Snape looked at him. "Your wrist. It's broken." Snape's expression did something complicated. He looked at the wrist. He looked at Harry's face, which showed nothing because Harry had decided before the car landed that showing pain to someone who was looking for a reaction was counterproductive. Then Snape made a sound that might have been the beginning of a word he reconsidered, and said, "Poppy will see to it," and that was how the wrist was handled. Dumbledore was more interesting. He appeared at the hospital wing an hour later, after Pomfrey had repaired the wrist with a mending charm and a sound commentary on the foolishness of 11, 12, Harry corrected, year-old boys, and he sat in the chair by Harry's bed and looked at him with those light, clever eyes and said nothing for a moment. "The barrier sealing," Harry said. "It was targeted." "Perhaps," Dumbledore said. "Not random. The timing and the method, it was too specific. Someone wanted us to miss the train. That's a considerable conclusion from limited evidence." "It fits the pattern," Harry said. "Last year someone was trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone. This year, whatever the year's problem is, it's starting with interference at King's Cross." He looked at Dumbledore directly. "What's the second thing?" "The thing underneath this one." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. His expression had the quality of a man genuinely deciding something, not performing the decision, but making it. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are going to find out regardless. The question is whether you find out with context or without it. With is preferable." Dumbledore looked at him with something that might have been, in another person, exasperated fondness. "Yes," he said, "I expect it is." He paused. "There is a diary. I suggest you pay close attention to anything that writes back." Then he left, which was classic Dumbledore, precise information delivered at the angle of maximum usefulness and minimum hand-holding, which Harry actually respected because it was honest about what the conversation was. He lay back and considered diaries that wrote back, and the Heir of Slytherin, and the Chamber of Secrets, which he'd read about in Hogwarts, a history and cross-referenced against two other sources, and the particular piece that kept eluding him, the mechanism, the how of it, and let his thoughts run their course. His wrist didn't hurt anymore. Pomfrey had been thorough. The warmth in his chest was steady. Whatever was coming, he was ready for it. He found Hermione in the library the next morning. This was not surprising. What was surprising was that she already had 3 books open on the table that were specifically about Hogwarts founding history, and she looked up when he sat down with the expression of someone who had been waiting. "The chamber," she said. Yes, Harry said. I've been thinking about the mechanism since the attack on Mrs. Norris, she said. It's clearly a basilisk. Harry looked at her. The petrifications, she said. The method of attack, indirect vision, because no one's died. Spiders fleeing. The smell in the corridors near the scenes, I've been recording it since the first incident. It's consistent with reptile musk at a very large scale. She turned her notes toward him. Basilisk. King of serpents. Eyes that kill, reflection that petrifies. Harry studied her notes. They were, as always, exhaustively logical. She'd built the argument in layers, each piece of evidence linked to the next with a careful notation of her confidence level. How long have you known? He said. 3 weeks, she said. I've been building the evidence base. Why didn't you tell me? I'm telling you now, she said. I wanted to be certain first. Harry looked at her for a moment. He understood the impulse. Building certainty before speaking was how he operated too, but there was something in her expression that suggested certainty wasn't the only reason for the delay. And? She was quiet for a beat. I wasn't sure you wouldn't do something immediately. Without support. Harry held her gaze. Like last year. Like last year. He thought about this honestly, which he owed her. He had a tendency, he knew it, had always known it, to move toward problems directly and solve them by the most efficient available route, and that route frequently didn't account for the preferences of people who wanted to be included. It wasn't arrogance. It was the habit of someone who had been alone for a long time and made decisions solo because that was the only available mode. You're right, he said. Hermione blinked. She'd clearly prepared for a defense. You're right. I do that. I'm working on it. He looked at the notes. The pipe system. The basilisk needs to move through the castle. The plumbing predates most of the castle's current structure, it'd be the right diameter and the right concealment. She recovered from his agreement with the speed of someone who processed surprises efficiently. Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, she said, pulling out a different page. The consistent haunting center around the second-floor girls' bathroom. The plumbing in that bathroom traces, according to the building records in the restricted section, to the original Salazar Slytherin construction phase. The chamber entrance is in the bathroom, Harry said. That's my conclusion as well. They looked at each other across the table, and Harry thought, this is how it's supposed to work. Not him solving things alone while others watched. This, two people who were good at thinking, working the problem together, each seeing pieces the other missed. We need to be able to open it, he said. The chamber opens for Slytherin's heir, presumably via Parseltongue. Can you? Hermione stopped. The bond. The magical development. Yes, Harry said. Since I was about 9. I didn't know what it was until I looked it up. Her expression was the particular kind of carefully composed that meant she was feeling something she hadn't decided to feel yet. All right, she said. Then we can open it. Together. Together, Harry agreed. She nodded once, firmly, the way she decided things. Then she picked up her quill and they worked through the rest of the logistics as the library filled up around them with the ordinary morning noise of students who had no idea there was a giant snake in the pipes beneath their feet, and Harry thought that Hermione Granger was, possibly, the most useful person he'd ever met, and also possibly the most important, which was a thought he filed away carefully for later examination. The basilisk, when it came to it, was handled. Not cleanly, not without cost. Harry's arm where the fong had grazed him before he'd gotten fox tears on it would carry a scar for years, thin and silver, which he found he didn't mind because it was honest, but handled. The diary destroyed, Ginny safe, Lockhart incapacitated by his own reversed memory charm, which Harry regarded as proportionate if not deliberate. What happened in Dumbledore's office afterward, with Lucius Malfoy and Dobby and the sock, Harry managed with the specific pleasure of someone solving a complex problem in real time. He'd understood what Dobby was the moment he'd seen him, not just a house elf but a bound creature actively trying to help him, which meant someone was actively trying to harm him, which narrowed the field considerably given the diary's role in the year's events. Lucius Malfoy stood in Dumbledore's office in expensive robes and looked at Harry with the particular expression of a man who had miscalculated and was deciding how to present it. His face was controlled. He was very good, Harry noted, at controlled, but something in the set of his jaw suggested he was revising several things simultaneously. Harry looked at him back with complete steadiness. Malfoy was intelligent. This was important. Stupid antagonists were problems you solved once. Intelligent ones were patterns you returned to. There was something in Lucius Malfoy's expression, something that ran beneath the contempt and the recalculation, that looked, when Harry studied it with the full attention he brought to important things, like the beginning of specific concern. Not about Harry. About what Harry was becoming. Harry filed this, shook Dobby's hand, and went to the hospital wing to have his arms seen to, and said nothing to anyone that night about the fact that Lucius Malfoy had spent approximately 3 seconds looking at him with the careful, measuring gaze of someone recognizing a problem they intended to address before it developed further. 3 seconds was enough. Third year opened a door that second year had barely cracked. Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban in August, and Harry read about it in the Muggle newspapers while staying at the Leaky Cauldron. He'd arranged to stay there for the last 2 weeks of summer, which had required a brief, efficient conversation with Cornelius Fudge that Harry had managed with the particular leverage of being Harry Potter, a name that still carried enough currency to make ministry officials obligingly flexible. He spent those 2 weeks reading everything available about Sirius Black, which turned out to be less than he wanted and more than was publicly known, because the ministry's record-keeping on Azkaban prisoners was public in the way that meant they'd published a version and kept the interesting parts back. What Harry established, Sirius Black had been convicted without a trial. This was documented, a detail in a ministry procedural record from 1981 that was publicly archived because the person who had archived it hadn't understood its significance, and it was the first piece of a picture that, when assembled carefully, looked substantially different from the official version. He kept this hypothesis provisional. He kept it to himself, because hypotheses about wrongful conviction of a man who had allegedly betrayed your parents required either proof or the right conversation partner, and he had neither yet. What he had was Hermione, who appeared at the Leaky Cauldron on the 11th of August with her parents in tow and a trunk that had approximately twice as many books as last year's, and who found Harry in the common room and sat down across from him and said, "You've been thinking about Sirius Black." "Yes," Harry said. "What's your conclusion?" "Provisional," Harry said. "But incomplete picture." She nodded. "I've been thinking about the timeline," she said. Pettigrew was found dead, or supposedly found dead, in the same incident that Black was arrested for. But the conviction record has a procedural anomaly. "No trial," Harry said. "No trial," she confirmed, and her eyes sharpened with the specific light of someone whose research has just been validated. Which is extraordinary, legally. Even in 1981, during the height of the war, there were supposed to be, she stopped. "You've already worked through all of this." "Yes. But your confirmation is useful." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat back slightly, in the way she did when she decided to settle into a conversation rather than conduct it. "Who is he to you? Apart from the official story?" "Possibly my godfather," Harry said. "The record lists him as my magical guardian. He can't have done what they say, or at least not in the way they say." He paused. "Or he can have, and it's more complicated than that. I don't know yet. But you're not afraid of finding out?" "No." She looked at him with something steady and warm in her expression. "Good," she said. Then she opened her trunk and pulled out 3 books on magical law and prisoner rights and said, "Then let's be thorough about it." Professor Remus Lupin was unexpected in the specific way that the best things were unexpected. Harry had prepared a hypothesis about the defense against the dark arts position, 1-year turnover, consistently, which was a pattern that had a reason behind it, and the reason he'd landed on was a curse on the post, which he'd found reference to in Binns' notes, which nobody else apparently read because Binns was considered a reliable cure for consciousness. The curse meant no one stayed. He'd expected another Quirrell, another Lockhart, someone performing something they weren't. Lupin was actually competent. Not just technically competent, though he was, clearly, substantively and seriously knowledgeable in a way Lockhart had not been and Quirrell had been but hidden, but competent in the specific sense of someone who understood what the students in front of him needed and moved toward providing it. He watched Lupin's first class with the quality of attention that clocked methods and motivations, and what he saw was a man who was kind without being soft, funny without performing it, and taught like someone who genuinely believed the students were capable. Also, he'd gone pale when he saw Harry. Not dramatically, a professional person's pale, controlled and brief, but Harry had been watching. After class, in the corridor, Harry stayed as the others filed out and said, "You knew my father." Lupin, packing his case, went still for exactly 1 second. Then he looked up. "What makes you say that?" "The way you looked at me when I walked in," Harry said. "It wasn't the scar. That reaction is usually different. Yours was more specific. Personal." Lupin looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was sad and genuine and didn't try to be anything else. "Yes," he said. "James and I were friends. Close friends." He paused. "You look very like him." "Everyone says that," Harry said. "Did you know Sirius Black?" The second pause was longer. "Yes." "Then maybe we should have tea sometime," Harry said. "When you're ready to." Lupin looked at him with an expression that was, Harry thought, the specific look of an adult encountering a child who is considerably further along than expected and having to quickly recalibrate everything they'd planned to say. "Yes," he said. "I think we should." Harry nodded and went to lunch. The warmth in his chest was steady and deep, and the world was full of pieces that were starting to want to fit together, and Harry was in no hurry because he had been patient for years and patience was something he'd gotten very good at. Nymphadora Tonks arrived in October. She arrived as part of an Auror demonstration day that the ministry ran annually for 4th years and above, which meant the 3rd years weren't technically included, which meant Harry attended anyway, because the cloak was useful and he'd already been in the back of lecture halls he wasn't meant to be in enough times to have developed a methodology. He was in the back of the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom when the Auror team arrived, 3 of them, senior team with enough experience between them to read the room correctly and run a demonstration that went beyond the theatrical. Their senior officer was a woman in her early 30s named Dawlish, efficient and humorless. Second was a wizard named Williamson, broad and quiet. And the third was the one who entered last and immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. She was young, mid-20s at most, with short pink hair that changed shade when she moved, violet when she tilted her head and then back to pink when she straightened. She was wearing standard Auror robes in the slightly rumpled way of someone who'd been on a case this morning and hadn't had time to change, and she tripped over her own feet in the doorway, caught herself with the quick instinctive grace of someone whose body knew what it was doing even when she pretended otherwise, and grinned at the watching students. "Tonks," Dawlish said, in the voice of a woman who had said this many times. "Here," Tonks said. Harry watched from the back under the cloak with the focused interest of someone who was seeing something genuinely unusual. She was a metamorphmagus, he could see it in the hair, the slight, fluid quality of her face, the way her features rearranged when she was making a point. But the metamorphmagus aspect wasn't the unusual thing. The unusual thing was her magic. He could feel it from the back of the room. A specific quality that he'd only felt a handful of times, in Dumbledore, in Lupin, in himself, in the very specific pulse of the bond on certain days. Structured depth was the best way he could describe it. Magic that had organized itself in layers and knew what it was. She was very powerful. She was also performing clumsiness that wasn't entirely real, but he didn't call attention to that because it wasn't his business why she did it. The demonstration ran for an hour. Dawlish and Williamson covered the practical material, standard Auror methodology, investigation techniques, legal framework. Tonks added commentary that was consistently sharper and funnier than the main material, and Harry watched the 4th and 5th years in front of him warm to her in the particular way people warm to someone who is genuinely entertaining while also clearly knowing what they're talking about. After the session ended and the students filed out, Harry slipped out with them and took the cloak off in the corridor, and was almost to the stairs when he heard quick footsteps behind him. "Oi," said Tonks. He turned. She was standing in the corridor, 7 feet away, with her hands in her Auror robe pockets, looking at him with bright eyes that were currently brown but had been a shade of amber he'd noticed when she laughed at her own joke 20 minutes ago. She was looking at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a professional who had been trained to pay attention. "You were in the back," she said. "Under something." "Research purposes," Harry said. "Research purposes," she repeated. "Right." She studied him for a moment. Her expression had the quality of something being worked out, like she was adding numbers and getting a surprising result. "Harry Potter." "Tonks, I think," Harry said. She grinned. "Nobody uses the first name by choice." "How long were you in there?" "The whole session." "And what did you think?" He considered the honest answer. "Dawlish runs a clean presentation. Williamson knows his material. You're the most capable of the 3 and you were underplaying for the audience." A pause. Her expression shifted through several things, surprise, then something that recalibrated into a different kind of attention. "That's a very specific observation for a 3rd year." "I've read about Auror assessment protocols," Harry said. "The fieldwork components test situational reading. You're clearly field-rated." Tonks looked at him for a long moment. "You're very calm," she said. "It's slightly unnerving." "People tell me that," Harry said. "I bet they do." She tilted her head, and her hair went briefly violet. "The Auror Service runs a shadow training program for Hogwarts students with strong enough magical profiles. Unofficial, off-books, it's basically just experienced officers making themselves available for questions. Lupin's name is already on the list, actually." Harry looked at her. "I'm not saying I'm offering," she said. "I'm saying the program exists." "You're absolutely saying you're offering," Harry said. She laughed, and it was a real one, no performance in it. "Yeah, all right. I'm absolutely offering." She reached into her robe pocket and produced a small card that had clearly been written recently, the ink still slightly bright, and held it out. "Owl me if you're interested." He took the card. She held his gaze for one more moment, and something passed through her expression that he'd have called recognition except he'd never met her before. Then she turned and went back toward the classroom with the slightly off gait she'd been performing all day. Harry looked at the card. Then at the corridor in the direction she'd gone. Something had shifted in the deep structure of his chest, not the warmth, not the low note, but something else, a 3rd register, lower than the other 2 and newer, like a bass string that had been there all along but hadn't been struck yet. He stood with it for a moment, feeling the shape of it, and then tucked the card away and went to dinner. He sat next to Hermione, who looked at him and said, "You went to the Auror demonstration." "Yes." "You're not a 4th year." "I'm aware." She looked at him sideways with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to be annoyed. "Then, how was it?" "Useful," Harry said. "There's a metamorphmagus on the team. Exceptionally capable." "Tonks," Hermione said immediately. "Nymphadora Tonks. She's in the records, she qualified as an Auror last year, youngest in a decade. Extremely high marks on the practical assessments." She paused. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you'd want to know," Harry said. She looked at him for another moment, and the low note in his chest was warm and present, and something in her expression softened very slightly before she went back to her dinner. Across the great hall, at the Slytherin table, Daphne Greengrass was watching. She wasn't obvious about it, she never was, but Harry caught it in his peripheral vision, the particular stillness of someone who was paying close attention to something they were trying not to appear interested in. He didn't acknowledge it. But the third note, the Tonks note, was finding its register in the deep architecture of his chest, and the structure of what was building was becoming, quietly, clearer. He old Tonks. She wrote back in 2 days with a meeting time and a location, a room in Hogsmeade that turned out to be a small private parlor above the 3 broomsticks, which Tonks apparently used as a base when she was working cases in the area. They met 4 times before the end of term, and the sessions were unlike anything Harry had encountered in an educational context, because Tonks taught the way she operated, direct, practical, and completely without condescension. "Why do you underplay?" Harry asked, in the 3rd session. Tonks looked up from the wand movement drill she'd been demonstrating. "What makes you think I do?" "You trip over things. Specifically in professional contexts, when you're demonstrating competence, you add a stumble. It makes people comfortable. It also makes them underestimate you." She was quiet for a moment. Her hair, which had been its default pink, went to a darker shade. "It's a field tactic," she said. "You want the person you're about to arrest to think they've got an edge." "It's also protection," Harry said, not unkindly. "Against something." Tonks looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been seen clearly and is deciding what to do with that. "You're 13, she said. "I know. You shouldn't be this," she paused. "People tell me that too," Harry said. She laughed, reluctantly, then sobered. "Yeah," she said. "It's protection. When you can look like anything, people don't know who you actually are. The clumsiness is real, it's a real quirk. I do trip on flat surfaces, that part's not a performance. But I lean into it because it's a thing that's just me. Not changed. Not optimized." She shrugged. "Hard to explain." "It's an anchor," Harry said. "Something that stays the same when everything else can change." She held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not warm, not yet, more like the first sign of warmth in something that had been cautiously closed. "Yeah," she said. "Exactly that. They did the drill." She was a genuinely excellent teacher, which was a different skill from being a brilliant practitioner, and she had both, and Harry came away from their sessions with things he could use immediately, not just techniques but frameworks for thinking about combat magic that his library study had gestured at but not given him the practical skeleton for. In the 4th session she said, at the end, while putting on her coat in the way of someone who has decided to say something sideways, "Have you ever heard of Veela secondary bonds?" Harry went still. "Auror training covers Veela law," she said, not looking at him, buttoning her coat with the focused attention of someone buying time. "The magic is, there's a detection protocol for it, in cases where it's being used as a form of coercion. And occasionally, in cases where the primary mate is exceptionally powerful, there are documented cases of." She stopped. Her hands had gone still on her coat buttons. Harry looked at her profile. "I'm a professional," she said, in a voice that was extremely controlled. "I'm 24 years old. I know what I'm doing and I know what's professional and appropriate and what isn't." "I know that," Harry said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were amber again, which he was starting to understand was the color they went when she wasn't managing herself, when whatever was underneath the professional and the cheerful and the deliberate clumsiness came through. "I'm not going to," she started. "I know," Harry said. "Nothing is going to, Tonks," he said, gently. "I know." She exhaled. "Right," she said. "Good." She finished buttoning her coat. "I'm going to keep coming back anyway," she said. "For the training. Because you're worth teaching." "I know that too," Harry said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh and picked up her bag. "Merlin, you're annoying," she said. Harry smiled, which he let her see because she deserved the honesty of it, and she rolled her eyes and left, and the third note in his chest was warm and complicated and real. The thing with Lucius Malfoy moved in the background of third year like weather that was building but hadn't broken yet. Harry first noticed it as a pattern, small things, individually meaningless. A ministry memo circulated in November that proposed new regulations on non-standard magical development in minors, which was specific enough language to catch his attention when he found a copy in the faculty lounge he wasn't supposed to be in. A visit from 2 ministry officials in January who spoke with Dumbledore for 3 hours and whose robes bore the seal of the Wisengamot's Magical Standards Committee. A letter to Draco Malfoy, intercepted by accident when an owl mixed up the dormitory directions, that contained no message but did contain a small, specifically enchanted token that Harry identified as a monitoring charm anchor. Someone was watching the school. Not cruelly, this wasn't surveillance for dark purposes, not yet. This was intelligence gathering. And in February, a development that clarified the shape of things considerably, a formal proposal was filed with the Wisengamot, flagged in the Daily Prophet in a 2-paragraph notice on page 11, that sought to establish an oversight framework for extra-institutional magical bonds, particularly those formed without proper consent documentation, and the proposal was sponsored by Lucius Malfoy. Harry read the article twice. The language was careful. Nothing in it was directly about him, nothing said Harry Potter or Veela bond or claiming mark. But the mechanism it proposed, a ministry registry for bonds formed before age 11, with provisions for review and potential dissolution, was targeted with a precision that suggested someone had done very thorough research. He folded the paper and went to find Hermione. She'd already seen it. She was in the library when he arrived, 3 legal texts open in front of her, and she looked up when he sat down and said, "It's not enforceable. The legal precedent for government dissolution of magical bonds is extremely narrow. The last successful case was 1847 and the circumstances were, it doesn't need to be enforceable," Harry said. "It needs to be threatening. Enough to make Fleur's family reconsider the bond's wisdom, enough to put the Delacours in a position where managing ministry pressure costs more than the bond is worth to them politically." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "He's not trying to break the bond," she said slowly. "He's trying to make keeping it politically expensive." "Yes." She closed the middle text and opened the one on the far left. "Then the counter isn't legal challenge. The counter is making the bond's value exceed the cost of the pressure." "Yes," Harry said again. She looked at him. "That requires the Delacours to value it enough to resist pressure. Which requires Fleur to," Harry paused. "Which requires a lot of things," he said, "that aren't in place yet." Hermione held his gaze. There was something in her expression that was careful and honest, something that was aware of all the complexity in that unfinished sentence. "The Triwizard Tournament," she said. "Beaux Batons is one of the competing schools. It was announced last week." Harry looked at her. "Fleur Delacour is 17, Hermione said. She would be eligible to enter." Her voice was exactly neutral. "Next year." The warmth in Harry's chest, the primary warmth, the one that had been there since he was 7, the one that had reshaped him and steadied him and made him what he was, surged. Not painfully. More like something waking up. Like the patience that had been building for 7 years finally registering, soon. "Right," Harry said, and felt it settle back to its steady pulse. "Then we have a year." "For what?" Hermione asked. "To be ready," Harry said. "For all of it." Hermione looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at her books, and said, "Right. Then we should start with the legal framework for formal bond acknowledgement, because if Malfoy is moving through the ministry, you'll need to know the countermoves." "Already started," Harry said, pulling out his own notes. She made a sound that was half exasperated and half fond, and they worked as the library went dark around them and the castle breathed in the night around its stones. Daphne Greengrass spoke to him directly for the first time since the January corridor conversation in early March of third year. Not in a corridor, not incidentally, she came to find him. He was on the grounds near the lake, reading, the afternoon having gone unexpectedly warm, and she came around the path from the castle with her hands in her robe pockets and her expression neutral and sat down on the rock 2 feet from him. He put his book down. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at the lake with the particular quality of patience that told him she'd come here with a purpose and was going to arrive at it in her own time. "My family," she said finally, "has been asked to provide a position paper to the Wisengamot Committee on Extra-Institutional Magical Bonds." She was looking at the lake. "Supporting the Malfoy proposal." Harry said nothing. "My father has agreed, provisionally." She paused. "I disagree with the position." "On what grounds?" Harry said. "On the grounds that state dissolution of magically formed bonds is a violation of fundamental magical liberty, historically misused, and would set a precedent that could be turned against any family whose alliances become inconvenient to those in power." She said it with the clean precision of someone who had thought it through completely and arrived at a firm conclusion. "Including my own family, eventually." "That's a very clear argument," Harry said. "It is," she agreed. "It's also not the only reason." She finally looked at him. Her pale gray eyes were direct, the way she was direct when she'd decided to be, which was its own thing to witness. She was usually precise, but directness was different from precision, it was personal. "I know what the pull is," she said. "I looked it up in first year, when I first felt it. I was 11 and I was," a pause, "unsettled by it. I didn't want to be unsettled by something I didn't understand, so I understood it." Harry looked at her. "Secondary resonance bond," she said. "Triggered by proximity to a primary Veela claimed mate of exceptional power. Presence as an involuntary attunement." She said it with the careful flatness of someone who had spent 2 years making it into information instead of feeling. "I know what it is. I know what it would mean for my family if she stopped. My father's neutrality policy is not a political convenience. It's a survival strategy. We have survived by being useful to both sides without being owned by either." "I understand that," Harry said. She looked slightly thrown by that, the way she always was when he met a complex thing simply. "Do you?" "Yes. It's intelligent. It's also finite." She looked at him. "Neutral is a position you can hold when the forces on either side are roughly equal," Harry said. "When one side grows large enough, neutral becomes untenable because it starts to look like opposition to the larger side. Your father knows this. The calculation only works until it doesn't." Daphne was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this?" "About most things," Harry said. She turned back to the lake. A pause that was different in quality from the one before, less preparatory, more real. "I'm not going to support my father's position paper," she said. "I can't stop him submitting it. But I can make my own opinion known, in the right channels." She paused. "I thought you should know someone on the Slytherin side of things was paying attention." "I appreciate it," Harry said. She stood, in the clean way she stood, without any of Tonk's deliberate untidiness. She started back toward the castle, and then she stopped. She didn't turn fully, just enough to address him over her shoulder. "The pull," she said. "Does it? I want to know if it goes both ways." Harry looked at her profile, the precise line of her jaw, her pale eyes in three-quarter view. He thought about what honesty required and what was fair. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, absorbing this. Her expression was its careful neutral, but something in it had shifted, very slightly, towards something more complicated and more honest. "Right," she said, and walked back to the castle. Harry watched her go. The notes were all present now, all 3 of them, and the primary warmth that had been there since the beginning, and the structure of it was becoming clear in a way it hadn't been before. Not a replacement for choice, not a cage, but a framework that choices would fill. He was 13 years old and he was patient, and he had a year before Fleur arrived and things accelerated toward whatever they were going to become. He picked up his book. Lupin was walking the grounds near the Forbidden Forest, 100 meters away, with the careful stride of someone managing something physical that took attention. He looked up and met Harry's eyes across the distance, and nodded, once. Harry nodded back. The afternoon held its warmth and the lake was silver in it, and the year had been what it was, full of things that mattered, full of pieces fitting into a picture that was becoming recognizable, and Harry felt, for the first time with real clarity, the shape of what was coming. Not frightening. Not small. Large, and real, and his. The Dementor on the train home was the last event of the year, and it was handled in the specific way Harry had decided to handle it, without drama, without the particular vulnerability that Dementors fed on, because what Dementors fed on was despair, and Harry had made a deliberate practice of not keeping despair in any accessible location. He heard the happiness he was holding, specific, clear, like something precious and exact, and he raised his wand, and the warmth in his chest became the silver light at the tip of it, and the Patronus that formed was not a wisp or a cloud or the struggling, half-formed thing of early practice. It was a stag. Fully corporeal, massive, light like poured silver, with the certain energy of something alive and sure of its own existence, and it moved down the corridor with a steady power that the Dementor didn't wait to contest. Lupin, in the seat across from him, made a sound. Harry looked at him. Lupin's face was doing several things at once, shock and grief and recognition and something that was almost wonder, watching the stag pace back toward the window and then dissolve as the Dementor retreated. He looked at Harry with eyes that were too bright. "Your father," he said, very quietly. "I know," Harry said. "The same Patronus form." "How did you?" Lupin stopped. "You're 13. "I know," Harry said again. Lupin looked at him for a long moment, and Harry let him look, because Lupin was seeing something he needed to see and there was no reason to take it away from him. Then Lupin reached into his case and produced a large piece of chocolate and held it out, and Harry took it because chocolate after Dementors was medically sound and also because Lupin needed to give it. Hermione, on his left, was watching him with that steady, unguarded expression she got sometimes when she forgot to manage it. Ron, on his right, was looking at the window where the stag had been with the expression of someone recalibrating a worldview. "Right," Harry said, breaking the chocolate into 3 pieces and distributing it. "We're almost there." They ate their chocolate. The train moved north to south, and behind them, Scotland fell away, and ahead was summer, and ahead of summer was the year that would change everything. Harry put his hand on his sternum, over the warmth. It pulsed back, certain as a heartbeat, patient as stone. Chapter 4. The tournament. The summer before 4th year was the one where everything that had been building finally started moving. Harry spent the first 2 weeks at Privet Drive, which was fine in the functional sense. Vernon had long since settled into a mode of ignoring him with disciplined commitment, Petunia occasionally left meals at reasonable temperatures, and Dudley had developed the specific avoidance behavior of someone who had learned, over several years, that his previous tactics produced no useful return. Harry used the 2 weeks to organize his notes, complete the reading list he'd set himself for the year ahead, and correspond with Hermione, who wrote back within a day of every letter, her replies dense with information and the occasional margin observation that was more personal than academic and which she seemed to include without entirely deciding to. He also wrote to Tonks, who had been assigned to a task force over the summer, and wrote back in quick, cheerful letters that were informationally spare but warm in a way she probably thought was less obvious than it was. And he wrote, for the first time, to Fleur. He'd been thinking about when to do this since March, when Hermione had mentioned the Triwizard Tournament with that careful neutral voice, and he'd settled on the summer because waiting until September felt like a performance of indifference he didn't need to make. He wrote the letter twice, once with too much in it, which he put aside, and once clean and direct. Fleur. You'll be at Hogwarts this year for the tournament. I thought you should hear from me before then rather than after. I'm looking forward to seeing you. Harry. He sent it with Hedwig on a Tuesday morning. Hedwig was back by Saturday with the faintest trace of French perfume on her feathers and a sealed letter in her talons. He opened it. "Harry. I have thought about writing to you many times and decided against it many times because I was not certain what to say. Now you have written first and so I must respond, and I find I am still not certain what to say. I am looking forward to it also. I have thought about it more than I intended to. Fleur." Harry read this twice and put it in the inside pocket of his trunk where he kept things that mattered. He was ready. The Quidditch World Cup arrived with the Weasley family, who collected Harry from Privet Drive with the specific chaos of a family that ran on affection and volume, and Arthur Weasley's delight in Muggle artifacts was so genuine that Harry found himself enjoying the Ford Anglia ride to the Portkey Point more than he'd expected to, watching Arthur examine a traffic cone with the reverent curiosity of an archaeologist. The match itself was everything he'd read about and several things he hadn't: the scale of it, 100,000 people in a stadium that shouldn't have fit them, the sky full of magic, Ireland and Bulgaria playing at the level that made professional Quidditch look like a different sport from what he played at Hogwarts. Victor Krum caught the snitch in the specific desperate way of someone making the best available decision in a losing position, which Harry filed as a data point. Krum was brilliant and technically exceptional and made choices under pressure with the decisive ruthlessness of someone who trusted himself entirely. He'd be at Hogwarts. He'd probably enter the tournament. Harry watched him dive through the Irish chasers for the snitch and thought, interesting. The Death Eaters in the night were less interesting and more immediately relevant. The dark mark in the sky, green and huge over the burning tents, was the first direct evidence Harry had had of what the war's return was going to look like from ground level, and he stood at the edge of the trees and looked at it with the quality of attention he gave things that were genuinely dangerous, total, clear-eyed, no performance of calm because the calm was real. The thing about the dark mark was that it was theater. It was designed to frighten, and it was very good at it, but it was theater, message without immediate physical threat. Someone had fired it to make a point. Harry thought about who that someone was and what the point was, and arrived, quickly, at the conclusion that whatever Voldemort's return looked like, it was going to look like escalating messages before it looked like direct action. He helped the Weasleys get organized and didn't mention his conclusions to anyone, because the night was already complicated enough and conclusions without evidence were hypotheses and hypotheses were private until they could be tested. On the walk back through the dark field, Hermione appeared at his side with the certainty of someone who had been looking for him. "The mark," she said. "Yes. You're not frightened." "I'm alert," Harry said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." She walked close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched on the uneven ground. "I am frightened," she said, in the tone of someone making a factual report. "A little." "That's sensible," Harry said. "The mark is a credible threat signal." "I know." A pause. "It helps." "That you're not." Harry looked at her briefly in the dark. She was looking forward, her expression the composed-over version she wore when she felt something she was managing. He thought about what to say and settled on honesty, which was always what she responded to best. "You don't need me to not be frightened for you to be all right," he said. "You're already all right. The fear is just information." She was quiet for a moment. Then she exhaled, the releasing exhale he recognized. "Right," she said softly. They walked back to the tents, and the mark burned in the sky above them, and Harry let his shoulder stay against hers because it was dark and the ground was uneven and she had said it helped. Hogwarts in September was different in a way that went beyond the tournament preparations, though those were considerable, the grounds crews repairing and extending parts of the castle, the Great Lake being dredged in a way that suggested something large was coming, the decorating committees that appeared to be operating in 3 different languages simultaneously as the visiting school's arrival approached. Harry felt the difference in the warmth in his chest. After 7 years of steady patience it was building now, not urgently but noticeably, like something winding up. He was in the entrance hall on the afternoon of the 30th of October when the Beauxbatons carriage arrived. He'd been there not by coincidence, he'd checked the arrival schedule posted in the faculty corridor and been in the area with a purpose, because there was a difference between waiting anxiously and being present with intention. He was standing near the doors when the winged horses descended and the enormous powder blue carriage landed with a sound like small thunder, and the doors opened, and the students came out. They came in a loose group, beautiful and cold-looking, Beauxbatons students in their pale blue robes with the specific bearing of people trained to have it, and Harry watched the door and then she was there. Fleur Delacour was 17 years old and he needed a moment to finish the thought, which was unusual, because Harry was not typically given to needing moments. She was taller than he remembered, which was logical because they had both been children, and the silver blonde hair was longer and the pale blue eyes were the same color they'd always been, lit from behind. She moved with the particular quality of a Veela descendant, something in the air displacing slightly around her as she walked. She was looking around the entrance hall with the careful, assessing attention of someone entering a new location and cataloging it. Her expression was composed. She was performing the Beauxbatons bearing with the ease of long practice. Then her eyes found him. 7 years of distance and the bond collapsed it in an instant. He felt it as a physical thing, the warmth in his chest expanding to something that was not heat exactly but was close to the feeling of something clicking into alignment, a lock and key quality, presence meeting presence after a very long time. She went still. Just for a half second, so quickly that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would have missed it. Then she kept walking, but her eyes didn't leave him, and he held them, and something passed between them that was adult in a way that 7-year-olds in Diagon Alley couldn't have known about. She stopped in front of him. The other Beauxbatons students flowed around them. "Harry," she said. Same deliberate pronunciation. Same eyes. "Fleur," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was working through several layers. "You are taller," she said. "You wrote that it helped," Harry said. "That I wrote first." Something in her face shifted, the composure developing a crack not of weakness but of something real showing through it. "I meant it," she said. "I know." She studied him the way she'd studied him at 7, like a problem she was trying to solve, but the problem had become more interesting over time. "You are very different from what I expected," she said, "and also exactly what I expected, which is a strange thing." "I know," Harry said. "Me too." The Beauxbatons headmistress, Madame Maxime, enormous and beautifully constructed, with the specific authority of someone who ran a school and knew it, was shepherding her students toward the great hall, and Fleur glanced toward the movement and back at him. "Tonight," she said. "After dinner. There is a courtyard on the south side." "I know it," Harry said. She looked at him sharply, and then the corner of her mouth moved, very slightly, toward something that was almost a smile. "Of course you do," she said, and turned to follow her school. Harry watched her go with the quality of attention he'd been saving for this for 7 years, and the warmth in his chest was broad and deep and full, and he turned back toward the castle and ran directly into Hermione. She was standing 2 feet behind him with her books held against her chest and her expression doing something complicated and honest that she caught and managed in the same second she registered he'd seen it. "I was going to the library," she said. "The library is the other direction," Harry said. She looked at him. A beat. Then, "She's beautiful." "Yes," Harry said, because there was no point in anything but honesty. Hermione absorbed this with the careful precision of someone filing a fact they don't entirely want. "She looked at you like," she stopped. "Like she's been thinking about it for 7 years, Harry said. "I know." Hermione's jaw worked slightly. "And you've been, waiting," Harry said. "Not pining. Waiting. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see the researcher in her wanting to ask more questions, and underneath it the person who was not entirely a researcher feeling something that the research had told her was probably inevitable and had not fully prepared her for anyway. "Right," she said. "I'm going to the library." "The other direction," Harry said. "I know where the library is," she said, and turned and walked toward it, and Harry watched her and felt both things simultaneously, the deep warmth of Fleur's proximity and the low note of Hermione's retreat, and they were not in conflict. They were both real. That was the thing he was still learning to hold. The courtyard conversation that night lasted 2 hours. It was cold and they didn't notice, sitting on the stone bench with the castle rising around them and the sky clear and full of stars. The conversation moved the way good conversations do when two people have been building toward them for a long time, not awkwardly, not with the performance of people getting to know each other, but with the specific fluency of a language you're speaking for the first time but somehow already know. Fleur told him about Beau's batons. About her younger sister Gabrielle, 6 years old and already showing Veela traits that worried their mother. About the politics of being quarter Veela in a school that valued lineage, which was complicated in ways Harry understood because he'd been navigating magical politics since he was 11. About the bond, she was direct about it, in the French way of directness that wasn't bluntness but was precision. She'd been reading about it since she was 7 and she knew what it meant, and she'd been watching herself feel its absence for years. The absence of what? Harry asked. Of you, she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had made peace with an embarrassing truth. It is not, I am not saying I spent 7 years pining, which is different. But there is a space in Veela bonds for the mate, and the space does not pretend he is not there. It is always aware of the gap. Harry thought about the warmth in his chest, the steady pulse of it for 7 years, patient as stone. I know what you mean, he said. She looked at him with those pale eyes. The bond also, she paused. I know you have the secondary resonance, she said. I know it since the books. Another pause, and for a moment she looked 17 and uncertain, which was the most human he'd seen her. I was angry about it, at first. When I understood it theoretically. That other people might feel the pull, Harry said. Yes. That other people might feel what I feel, which I had decided was, she stopped. Specific, Harry said. She looked at him. Yes. A pause. And then I thought about it more carefully and I realized that secondary bonds do not happen in ordinary cases. They happen when the primary mate is exceptional. Which means the secondary bonds are not a diminishing of what I have. They are, she searched for the word. Evidence, Harry said. Fleur blinked. Then that almost smile again. Yes. Exactly. Evidence. She sat with this for a moment. I am still, she pursed her lips, I am still Veela enough to find the idea uncomfortable. I will be honest about this. Veela bond, this is not conventional. I know, Harry said. Are you going to enter the tournament? She looked at him. You changed the subject. You were going to say something about it being unconventional that I didn't want us to spend the evening deciding how to feel about before it's necessary, Harry said. Yes. She studied him. You are very annoying, she said, in a tone that meant something else. People tell me that, he said. She laughed, a real one, clear and French and surprised, and it was the best sound he'd heard in years. Yes, she said, to the tournament question. I am going to enter. I am the best student in my year at Beau's batons. It would be strange not to. I'm going to enter too, Harry said. You are 14, she said. The age restriction is going to be circumvented, Harry said. By something. I don't know the exact mechanism yet. But my name is going in the goblet. You cannot know that. I can predict it, Harry said. The pattern of the last 3 years suggests that whatever Hogwarts offers, it usually includes someone specifically trying to put me in danger. The tournament is a very large, very public opportunity. Fleur looked at him for a moment with a complicated expression. This does not concern you? Concern, yes, Harry said. Frighten, no. She was quiet for a moment. The bond, she said. It made you very difficult to frighten. It gave me what I needed, Harry said. The rest was work. She looked at him, actually looked at him, the full Veela attention of it, which he felt in the warmth in his chest like sunlight through glass. Yes, she said softly. I can see the work. They sat in the cold courtyard under the stars until a patrolling prefect's light appeared around the eastern corner, and then they parted with a practicality that was not coldness but was the sensible management of two people who had just covered a lot of ground and needed time to let it settle. As she walked away, she stopped and looked back. You knew where the courtyard was, she said. You knew I was going to suggest meeting here. I guessed, Harry said. You knew, she said, with certainty. He smiled, which she saw, and she turned and walked away with something in her step that wasn't there before. The goblet of fire was installed 3 days later in the entrance hall, a vast wooden cup with blue-white fire, and the age line drawn around it in gold was Dumbledore's work, careful, well-constructed, tied to the ancient magic of the school. It would keep out underage students. Unless the magic compelling the entry was old enough and specific enough to override it. Harry stood at the edge of the age line on the Thursday evening before entries closed and looked at it with the focused clarity he brought to problems. The warmth in his chest was doing something it did when he was about to do something the bond considered important, a specific deepening, like a held breath. He'd thought about this carefully. He could get around the age line, he was reasonably certain of it, through a combination of the Veela bond's amplification of his core and a specific application of the intent principle from the Malkin papers, which said that magic governed by intent rather than form could pass through restrictions keyed to form rather than intent. The restriction was keyed to age. His intent was self-referential rather than age-dependent. The practical question was whether he should. He thought about what he'd told Fleur, his name was going to be entered regardless. If that was true, and he was sufficiently confident to call it likely rather than possible, then the choice was between his name going into the goblet on his own terms or someone else's terms. He chose his own terms, which was the only choice he'd ever really been capable of making. He reached into his robe and took out the folded slip of parchment with his name on it and walked to the age line. The magic of the line met him. He felt it assess, a flickering magical intelligence, Dumbledore's craftsmanship, very good, and he let it feel what he was, which was a 14-year-old with a magical core that had been developing under a Veela bond since he was 7 and was not, in any meaningful sense of the term, the magical equivalent of an ordinary 14-year-old. The line parted. He put the parchment in the goblet and walked back out. Behind him, as he reached the corridor, he heard footsteps and then Hermione's voice, sharp and low, "Harry Potter, what did you just do?" He turned. She was standing at the edge of the entrance hall with her cloak still on, like she'd come specifically to intercept him, which she probably had. "I entered," he said. "The age line parted," he said. Her expression went through something complicated. "How?" "Intent-based application of the Malkin principles," he said. "The line is keyed to age rather than intent. My core reads differently because of the bond." She stared at him. Then she looked at the goblet and back at him. "You think someone's going to put your name in anyway?" "Yes." "And you'd rather control the entry," Harry said. "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her doing the logical assessment, working the argument, finding it solid, arriving at the conclusion even though she didn't want to. "All right," she said. "But if this works and you're selected, then I'll need good support," Harry said. She looked at him with that steady, unguarded expression. "You'll have it," she said. At the Slytherin end of the entrance hall, in the shadow of the archway toward the dungeon stairs, a pale figure in a school robe had been standing long enough to have seen everything. Daphne Greengrass watched Harry and Hermione finish their conversation and separate, and she looked at the goblet burning blue-white in the center of the hall for a long moment, and then she made a decision that involved no more visible deliberation than a single quiet exhale. She walked to her dormitory. She came back in 4 minutes with a slip of parchment. She stood at the age line. The line didn't part for her. She wasn't expecting it to, she was 14, her core was powerful but not bond-amplified, and she wasn't interested in bending the rule. She folded the parchment and put it back in her pocket and looked at the goblet for another moment. She was thinking about Lucius Malfoy and ministry pressure and position papers. She was thinking about her father's neutrality and what it cost and what it didn't protect. She was thinking about a conversation on a rock by the lake in March, and amber-eyed women in Hogsmeade parlors, and a boy who had looked at her across a potions class and helped someone weaker without any performance of virtue. She put the parchment back in her pocket and went to the library instead. She had research to do. Not on the tournament. On the legal mechanisms for formally registering a secondary bond before a Wisengamot committee could move to delegitimize it. The goblet made its selection on Halloween night. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, Victor Crumb for Durmstrang, Fleur Delacour for Beaux Batons. The hall was exactly as Harry had expected, loud, celebratory, the tournament beginning. Then the goblet flared red again. The hall went quiet. The piece of parchment drifted from the cup's mouth and Dumbledore caught it and read it with an expression that was perfectly controlled and entirely alert. "Harry Potter," he said. The silence was specific and total. Harry stood up from the Gryffindor table and walked to the front of the hall. He was aware of the reaction around him, the sound building from the Slytherin table, Draco's voice, Hufflepuff's indignation on behalf of Cedric, the general noise of a school that had just received unexpected information, and he was aware of Fleur's eyes on him from the Beaux Batons table, which were pale and sharp and had the quality of someone who had just heard confirmation of something they already knew. He walked past Dumbledore and through the door at the back to the side chamber where the three champions were waiting. Cedric Diggory, large and fair and good-natured in his evident confusion. Victor Crumb, compact and watchful, who looked up when Harry entered and assessed him with the quick, precise eyes of a professional. Harry nodded at both of them and stood near the fireplace. Dumbledore came through, and the other heads, and Bagman, and Moody, and it was Moody Harry watched most carefully, because Moody's magical eye never stopped moving and had tracked Harry through the door with an attention that was too specific to be general vigilance. The conversations happened. Harry let them happen, responding to what was asked, watching the room. Maxime's outrage was genuine. She'd entered Fleur fairly and didn't appreciate what looked like British manipulation. Karkaroff's was political, thinner. Bartemius Crouch's was legalistic and the most interesting. He was a man holding himself very rigidly against something, and rigidity like that usually had a reason. "Must compete," Crouch said. "Binding magical contract." "I know," Harry said. Everyone looked at him. "I know it's binding," Harry said. "I entered." The age line parted. "I understand the implications and I'm not asking to withdraw." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'm asking who else's handwriting is on the parchment with my name." Dumbledore's eyes met his, and in them Harry saw the very specific expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by him but remained, consistently, interested. "You think your name was submitted by a second party?" "I know my handwriting," Harry said. "When you examine the parchment, you'll find an overlay. Someone used a confundus charm on the goblet to add the fourth entry." The room was quiet. "And," Harry continued, "whoever did it is probably in this castle. Probably has been since September. And has a goal that requires me in the tournament rather than dead, which narrows the category considerably." Moody was looking at him with his real eye, which was doing something specific. Harry met it and held it, and Moody made a sound deep in his throat that might have been approval or might have been something else. "We'll examine the parchment," Dumbledore said, calmly. "Good," Harry said. "In the meantime," he turned to Cedric, "congratulations. Legitimate Hogwarts champion." Cedric looked at him with a surprised, honest expression. "Cheers," he said. Harry nodded. He looked at Crumb, who was watching him with those quick, professional eyes. "You fly excellently," Harry said. The feint in the final was better than the execution required. Crumb's expression, which had been closed and watchful, shifted slightly toward something more engaged. "You watched closely," he said. "I always watch closely," Harry said. Something in Crumb's face moved toward a complicated kind of respect. He nodded once, which Harry returned. Then Fleur was at his shoulder. She'd moved through the room with the specific directness of someone who had made a decision, and she looked at him with those pale eyes and said, quietly, so only he heard it, "I told Madame Maxime you did not cheat." "Thank you," Harry said. "She did not believe me," Fleur said. "I told her it did not matter. You are my mate and you did not cheat, and she will see that in time." She said it with the clean certainty of someone stating a fact, and the warmth in his chest expanded into something that was close to overwhelming before he steadied it, because they were in a room full of people and he was not going to be overwhelmed in a room full of people. "Your mate," he said. She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "My mate." A pause. "Is this a problem for you?" "No," he said. "Good," she said, and moved back toward Maxime with the bearing of someone who has handled the thing she came to handle. Harry turned back to the fire and felt the warmth settle into something new, not patient anymore, not waiting. Present. Real and present and happening. The first task was dragons. Harry found out through Hagrid, who showed him in the characteristic Hagrid way, which was genuinely well-intentioned and involved standing near a dragon enclosure at midnight in a way that was theoretically covert. The horntail was his. He found this out through a combination of working backward from which breeds were assigned to which champions, a brief conversation with a dragon handler who was happy to confirm for someone who didn't seem frightened, and the basic probability that the worst assignment would land on the most complicating contestant. He told Cedric the next morning before breakfast. He found him in the corridor outside the Great Hall and said, "Dragons. Your task is a dragon. I think they want you to get past it to a golden egg." He watched Cedric's face process this. "You should know. It's not a secret worth keeping." Cedric looked at him for a long moment. "You're telling me?" "You're the legitimate champion," Harry said. "You should have the same information I have." Cedric shook his head, not in refusal but in the specific way of someone processing unexpected decency. "What are you going to do?" "Something involving flying," Harry said. "I think that's the most efficient approach to the horntail specifically. It's territorial rather than aggressive in range, so altitude and speed matter more than fireproofing." "You're going to fly against a dragon." "I'm going to outmaneuver a dragon," Harry said. "There's a distinction." Cedric looked at him with the expression Harry had started to recognize as his version of the McGonagall reaction, the one where someone expected a type of person and got a different one and had to revise quickly. "Right," Cedric said. "Thanks, Harry." "Good luck," Harry said. He acioed his firebolt. Sirius had sent it in September, with a letter that contained 3 lines of text and a postscript that said simply show them what a Potter can do, on the day of the task, which Hermione watched from the stands with her hands clasped and her face set to the composure she used when she was genuinely frightened and refusing to show it. The arena was packed and loud and smelled of scorched earth and nervous magic. Harry stepped onto the grounds and looked at the Hungarian horntail and felt the clean, focused still. The dragon was enormous, black-scaled and golden-eyed and radiating heat that he could feel from 30 feet away, and it was watching him with the particular attention of a very large predator who had already assessed the space between them and found it insufficient for concern. Harry raised his wand. Accio firebolt. The broom was there in seconds. He mounted, kicked off, and went vertical. The horntail's neck swung skyward. It was fast, faster than the research had suggested, and he adjusted the assessment in real time, banking right as the first jet of flame crossed where he'd been and feeling the heat on his cheek. He went higher, above the flame range, and the dragon followed his movement with its eyes but couldn't elevate further without leaving the eggs, and that instinct, the territorial anchor of the nest, was the lever he'd identified. He could dance up here all afternoon. He could also end this in 4 minutes. He dove. Not at the eggs, that was the decoy move. He dove at the dragon's left side, toward the hindquarters, in the specific arc that required the dragon to turn its body to track him, and turning the body meant briefly uncovering the eggs, and covering the eggs again meant turning back, and in the transition between those two turns there was a half-second window. He pulled up hard, firebolt screaming, and the golden egg was in his hand, and the crowd made a sound like weather. He landed. The dragon was already settling, the instinct threat passing, eggs confirmed present, and Harry stood on the ground and turned the egg in his hands and thought, for minutes and 12 seconds. He'd estimated 4. Close enough. In the stands, Hermione was on her feet. Beside her, Ron was making a sound that was probably words. 2 rows back and to the left, Daphne Greengrass was standing very still, her expression doing something she hadn't entirely decided to let it do. And in the champion's viewing area, Fleur Delacour was watching him with those pale eyes, and whatever was in her expression was not concealed and was not small. Harry walked toward the medical tent with the egg under his arm, and Fleur met him at the tent entrance, because of course she did. She looked at him, at the singed edge of his robe, at the small burn on his left forearm from the second fire jet, at his face, which was, she probably noted, entirely calm. "That was very stupid," she said. "And very brilliant." "Thank you," Harry said. She reached up and touched the burn on his forearm with 2 fingers, lightly, and the warmth in his chest responded to the contact with an immediacy that he had to breathe through. Her touch was careful and proprietary in the way of someone who has a claim and knows it. "Madame Pomfrey can, I know," Harry said. "After." She looked at him. "After what?" "After this," he said, and held her gaze in the specific way he'd been learning to hold it, fully, without reservation, and she looked back, and 7 years of distance and patient waiting sat between them and neither of them looked away. "You are infuriating," she said, in a very different tone from the first time she'd said it, 7 years ago in the courtyard at Privet Drive. "I know," he said, and the corner of her mouth pulled and the warmth between them was real and full and alive. The Yule Ball was announced 2 weeks later. Harry took Fleur, which was not a surprise to anyone who was paying attention, and which caused a ripple of reaction through the school that he found moderately entertaining, the mix of people who were astonished by the apparent age difference and people who understood it and a smaller, quieter subset of people for whom the announcement was personally significant. Hermione appeared in the library that evening with the expression of someone who has done something brave. She sat down across from him and said, "Victor Crumb asked me to the ball." Harry looked at her. "He's not, I mean, he clearly," she paused, and the careful composure did something it rarely did, which was crack slightly along the edge. "He's very attentive," she said. "He's been in the library almost every day. I think he's," she stopped again. "He's interested in you," Harry said. She looked at the table. "Yes. Obviously." A pause. "I said yes." Harry held her gaze when she looked up. "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good. Victor Crumb is an intelligent person with exceptional skill who clearly has enough sense to recognize what's in front of him," Harry said. "You should go. You'll have a good time." Something moved through her expression, complicated and quick, several things at once. "You're not," she stopped. "What?" Harry said. She looked at him with something honest and slightly raw. "Nothing," she said. "I just thought you might." She stopped for the 3rd time, and this time she gathered herself with the deliberate precision she used when she was being very honest about something she'd rather not be. "I thought you might have some kind of reaction." "I have a reaction," Harry said. "The reaction is that I want you to go to the ball with someone who sees you clearly and have a good evening. That is my reaction." "Harry, I also have other reactions," he said, more quietly. "But those are mine to manage. They don't give me any claim on what you do." She stared at him. Then she looked at the table for a moment, and when she looked back up there were no extra layers, just Hermione, clear-eyed, genuine, slightly undone. "The secondary bond research," she said. "Yes. Yes, Harry said. And you're patient, he said. I'm patient. That doesn't mean absent. He held her gaze. Go to the ball. Let Victor Crumb see what he sees. And know that I know what's there. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Something in her settled, not into resignation but into something that was more like the peace of being fully seen. You're very, she started. Infuriating, Harry supplied. She laughed, surprised out of whatever she was feeling, and it was warm and real and the low note in his chest was full. That's not what I was going to say, she said. What were you going to say? She looked at him. Then she picked up her quill and said, with her eyes on her parchment and a very precise smile, sufficient. Harry smiled at his own parchment and they revised in silence, and the library was warm and the night was outside and everything that was happening at its own pace and in its own time, and that was the only way it was ever going to work. The ball itself was an education. He danced with Fleur, which was, the word for it was inevitable, in the way that some things are inevitable not because they're forced but because they're the correct conclusion of a long equation. She danced the way she did everything, with the precise grace of someone who had been trained and also had the music in her, and they moved through the pattern of the formal dance in the warm candlelight of the great hall and she talked to him in French when the music was slow enough for conversation, quick and personal and assuming he followed, which he did, because he'd taught himself over the summer because he'd known he'd want to. She noticed the French halfway through the second song. You learned, she said, in English, her voice doing something involuntary. Over the summer, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. They were still dancing and she was looking at him with an expression that was doing several things she'd decided not to conceal. Why? She said. So you wouldn't have to translate, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she did something he hadn't seen before, the composure went down entirely, all of it, and what was underneath was just Fleur, 17 and real and feeling something large. She didn't speak. She stepped slightly closer in the dance and he felt the warmth of the bond between them as a physical warmth, real and mutual, not metaphor. Harry, she said, very quietly. I know, he said. You always say that, she said. Because I usually do know, he said, which made her exhale something that was half laugh and half something else, and they danced. Across the hall, Hermione was at the table with Victor, and she was laughing at something he'd said, and the low note in Harry's chest was present and steady and not sad. He met her eyes once across the room and she held them for a moment and then looked back at Victor, and that was fine. That was exactly right. At the far end of the hall, near the Slytherin cluster, Daphne Greengrass was at a table with her escort, a sixth-year Harry didn't know well, and she was watching Harry and Fleur with an expression that had given up being neutral for the evening. Not pained. Not angry. Something more honest than both. He didn't go to her. The evening was not the time. But he was aware of her the way he was always aware of her, the third note, low and real and patient, and he thought, soon. Not tonight. Soon. After the dancing, in the cold of the grounds where students had spilled out into the rose garden, he and Fleur sat on a stone bench and she leaned against him with the easy certainty of someone claiming a long-awaited thing, and he felt her warmth against his side and the warmth in his chest was broad and full and not alone anymore. The second task, she said. I have worked out the egg. The clue. So have I, Harry said. She looked up at him. Of course you have. A pause. What will they take from you? As the thing you'll miss most? Harry thought about it. The warmth in his chest, the low notes beneath it. People, he said. They cannot take me, Fleur said, with complete Veela certainty. The bond would not permit it without my distress becoming a magical event. I know, Harry said. That leaves others. Fleur was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet she had when she was thinking about something she wanted to address carefully. The secondary bonds, she said. I can feel them, you know. Not strongly, but I can feel that they are there. She paused. I have made my peace with them. Have you? Harry said. She looked at him. Almost, she said, with a honesty he respected deeply. I am still Veela enough to find it uncomfortable, Harry said. Infuriating, she said, with a very specific look. Apparently everything about me is infuriating, Harry said. Yes, Fleur said, simply. But I would not change any of it. They sat in the cold garden and the music from the ball reached them faintly and the stars were the same stars they'd been his whole life, and Harry felt, for the first time, that the shape of things to come was not abstract. It was here. It was all of these people and this bond and this school and the things that were going to try to stop it, Lucius Malfoy moving through the Ministry, Voldemort building in the shadows, the tournament with its remaining tasks, and he was not afraid of any of it. He was the wall. He had always been the wall. He just had more to stand for now. Chapter 5. The war inside. The second task came and went like most things Harry had prepared for, less dangerous than intended, more interesting than expected. He'd worked out the egg's clue in November, 3 weeks after the ball, sitting in the prefect's bathroom with the egg open underwater and Myrtle hovering in the pipes with her characteristic combination of mournfulness and nosiness. The clue was mere people. The lake. An hour to retrieve what had been taken. He'd also worked out, through a combination of research and logical elimination, that the thing taken would be a person. He'd spent 2 weeks after that ensuring his two most obvious candidates, Hermione and Fleur, were never alone near the lake before task day, which required a level of subtle management that he executed without either of them noticing, which he considered quietly impressive. What he hadn't accounted for was Gabrielle. He was 60 feet under the lake when he found them, 4 figures tethered to a stone plinth in the Mere People village, floating in the cold black water with the stillness of enchanted sleep. Hermione was there, which told him whoever had designed this task had done exactly what he'd predicted. Next to her, Ron Weasley, who would have been Crumb's person. Next to Ron, a small silver-haired girl he placed immediately as Fleur's sister. He knew Fleur was in the task. He knew, because he'd calculated the distances and timings, that she was moving through a different part of the lake and had been delayed. The Mere People would have created obstacles for each champion, and Fleur's Veela heritage, while useful in air, was complicated underwater. She wasn't going to arrive in time for Gabrielle. Harry cut all 4 hostages free. He ignored the Merpeople's theatrical objections. The task's rules were clear, 1 hostage per champion, but Harry's approach to rules that required leaving a 6-year-old child tied to a rock while he swam to the surface was straightforward and involved not doing that, and he got all 4 of them moving toward the light. He surfaced 64 minutes into an hour. He'd been precise but not quite fast enough, and the judges had been about to call it. The watching crowd was enormous, students and faculty and tournament officials, and in the front of the stands Fleur was wrapped in a blanket and wet-haired and clearly had not made her time and was visibly, furiously distressed about Gabrielle. Harry came up with Gabrielle in his arms and Hermione surfacing beside him, and found the dock and deposited Gabrielle into Fleur's immediate reach. Fleur's expression when she took Gabrielle, the quality of it, the relief and then the quick, fierce look she turned on Harry, was something he felt in the warmth in his chest as an entirely distinct phenomenon. She said something in rapid French that he was fairly sure translated as something between "thank you" and "I am going to have strong feelings about this later," and he said, "She's fine," and hauled himself up onto the dock and sat dripping in the Scottish morning cold while the judges had a spirited disagreement about what to do with someone who had technically broken the rules in the specific direction of rescuing more people than required. They gave him second place and a set of points that were, Hermione told him later with the precision of someone who had done the maths, exactly where he needed to be going into the third task. He wasn't thinking about the points. He was thinking about Moody's magical eye, which had been tracking him from the judge's platform with the specific focused attention of someone who had invested something in this outcome and was reassessing. The thing about Crouch Sr. was that he'd stopped attending meetings in February. Harry had noticed this the way he noticed patterns, not dramatically, just as a data point that went in the column of things that might matter later. A man of Crouch's rigidity and professional dedication didn't simply stop attending unless something had changed in his immediate circumstances drastically enough to prevent it. He added this to the column that already contained Moody's too specific attention, the confundus charm on the goblet, the graveyard rumors filtering through Hogwarts gossip about disturbances in Little Hangleton, and a very quiet conversation he'd had with Sirius in February via Flo in the empty office of a teacher who was currently at a ministry meeting. Sirius, thinner than his photograph suggested he should be after a decade plus in Azkaban, had looked at Harry through the fire with the expression of someone who'd been given something extraordinary and was still learning to be careful with it. They'd spoken for 40 minutes. Sirius had told him about Peter Pettigrew, the confirmation Harry had needed, the missing piece, and had told him about Voldemort's movements in the fragments that Dumbledore shared with him, and had looked at Harry throughout with the specific mixture of grief and amazed pride that Harry filed very carefully in the place he kept things that were too important to examine quickly. After the factual part of the conversation, Sirius had said, "You're very different from how I thought you'd be." "How did you think I'd be?" Harry said. "Angrier," Sirius said. "At everything you missed." "At me, maybe, for not being there." Harry had considered this honestly. "Being angry at what wasn't there seems less useful than working with what is," he said. Sirius had looked at him through the green flames for a moment and said, quietly, "James would have liked you." "I know," Harry said. "I would have liked him." They'd both sat with that for a moment, and it was its own kind of grief, clean and acknowledging. "Watch Moody," Sirius had said, at the end. "Something's wrong with him that I can't name yet." "I know," Harry had said, because he did know, or nearly knew, the shape of it was becoming clear. The shape completed itself in early May, 8 days before the third task. Harry had been watching Moody for months. Not obviously, he watched everything not obviously, it was simply how he operated, but with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things he'd categorized as potentially dangerous. Moody's magical eye could see through invisibility cloaks, through walls, through most material obstructions. The real Moody's eye had been this way for 30 years. But the eye Harry had been watching all year had slightly different habits from the accounts he'd read. It favored the left sweep when the documented preference was right, and it tracked moving objects a half-second slower than the records of Moody's fieldwork suggested it should. The eye was in the right head. The head was the wrong man. Harry confirmed this in the specific way he confirmed most things, by following a logical chain to its conclusion and then looking for the evidence at the end of it rather than working forward from evidence to conclusion. He found the evidence in Moody's office on a Tuesday evening when Moody was at a staff meeting, in the form of a seventh trunk in a set of apparently identical trunks that had a false-bottomed lock Harry recognized from a chapter in a magical containment text as an occupation layer construct, a trunk that held a person in an extended space. He didn't open it. He noted it and left the office exactly as he found it and went to Dumbledore. He walked into Dumbledore's office without knocking and said, "Moody isn't Moody. Polyjuice, I think, sustained for the year. The real Moody is in a trunk in his office, 7th from the left, occupation layer construct." He paused. "I think whoever it is has been managing my tournament entries to get me to the graveyard in the third task. The cup is probably a portkey." Dumbledore was standing at his window. He turned and looked at Harry for a long moment, and the expression on his face was the one Harry had learned to read as genuine, past the performance of benign eccentricity, past the management, into something real. "Sit down, Harry," he said. "I'd rather stand," Harry said. "What I need from you is a commitment to move on this now, tonight, before the 7th trunk becomes unavailable." A pause. "You've been building this picture for how long?" "Since November," Harry said. "Gradually clearer since February." "And you didn't come to me before because I was waiting for something close enough to prove to be actionable," Harry said. "I have it now." Dumbledore looked at him with those bright, complex eyes, and Harry felt the specific quality of Dumbledore's intelligence, vast and structural, like standing next to something old, and held his gaze without performance. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "We move tonight." It was Bartemius Crouch Jr. Harry had suspected as much: the Crouch Sr. disappearance, the Death Eater connection, the specific nature of the goblet's manipulation. They found him in the trunk, they found Crouch Sr.'s body in the forest, they administered Veritaserum and heard the plan in Crouch's own voice: the portkey, the graveyard, the ritual, the return. Dumbledore dismissed everyone except Harry and sat with him in Moody's office for a long time afterward and said, "You understood that this was a trap and you were going to walk into it anyway." "I understood it could be prevented," Harry said. "That's different. If we hadn't moved tonight, I would have gone into the maze with the portkey identified," Harry said. "I wouldn't have touched the cup." Dumbledore looked at him. "You had a contingency." "I have contingencies for most things," Harry said. A long pause. "You are," Dumbledore said, carefully, "not what I expected you to be." "I know," Harry said. "Is that a problem?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, and it was the most genuine one Harry had seen from him, not the performed twinkle, not the management of impression, but something real and slightly wondering. "No," he said. "It is not a problem at all." Lucius Malfoy arrived at Hogwarts 3 days later. Not to Harry, not directly, he arrived in Dumbledore's office as a representative of the Wisengamot's Magical Standards Committee, with 2 solicitors and a formal notice of investigation document that ran to 11 pages and concerned, in the language of ministry bureaucracy so dense it required translation, the following: the unauthorized circumvention of an age line by a minor, the suspected improper influence of a Veela claiming bond on the judgment of said minor, and a formal request for the bond to be submitted to ministry examination and assessment. Harry knew about the meeting because Hermione knew about the meeting because Daphne had sent Hermione a note on the morning it happened that said simply, "Lucius Malfoy. Today. Dumbledore's office. The committee proposal is moving to formal action." Harry was in the library when Hermione arrived with the note, and she sat down across from him and put it on the table between them and they both looked at it. "It's the bond," Hermione said. "Yes. The committee can't legally dissolve it," she said. "I've been through the precedent exhaustively. The 1847 case, the 1903 amendment to the Magical Bonds Act, Rathmore vs. Wisengamot 1952, the legal position isn't the point," Harry said. "The legal position is the surface. Underneath it, what Lucius wants is for the Delacours to find the bond politically expensive enough to voluntarily withdraw." Hermione was quiet for a moment, fingers pressing flat on the table. "And if they do, they won't," Harry said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because Fleur won't," Harry said simply. Something passed through Hermione's expression, complicated and quick. "And if the committee issues a formal examination notice, the bond becomes a matter of ministry record, which means it goes to a public Wisengamot session," Harry said. "Where Lucius has votes and influence and the ability to frame the narrative." He paused. "Unless we get there first." "Get there first how?" Harry looked at her. "Formal registration of all active bonds under the Voluntary Declaration Clause. Before the committee can issue a compelled examination notice. A voluntary declaration takes the initiative away from them. We're not responding to investigation, we're choosing disclosure." Hermione stared at him. "The Voluntary Declaration Clause hasn't been invoked in, I'd have to check, but decades. And it requires all parties to a bond to," she stopped. "Harry, the secondary bonds would have to be declared too." "Yes," Harry said. The silence stretched. "All of them," she said. "All of them," he confirmed. She looked at the table. He watched her face do the work, the logical part and the personal part, both running simultaneously, and she was very good at keeping them separate, but the personal part was too large today to fully contain. "That would mean," she said carefully, declaring publicly, to the ministry, "that there is a secondary bond between you and," "Yes," Harry said. "And between you and," "Yes." "And between you and Tonks." "Yes." A long pause. The library was quiet around them, late afternoon light coming through the high windows in long gold bars. "I need to think about this," Hermione said. "I know," Harry said. "You should. This has to be a choice. It can't be anything else." He held her gaze and made sure what he was about to say was exactly what he meant. "Nothing about this is obligation, Hermione. If declaring the bond publicly is something you don't want, for your own reasons, any reasons, then we find another approach. Your choice matters more than the tactical advantage." She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes. "You mean that?" "Obviously," he said. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked back at him with the expression she wore when she had made a decision that was going to cost her something and she had decided the cost was worth it. "I need to talk to Fleur," she said. Harry blinked. Of the things he'd expected her to say, that was in the top 10 but not the top 5. About the fact that she has a right to know who the secondary bonds are with, Hermione said. "Specifically. Not just as an abstract concept." Her jaw was set. "She's your primary mate and she's chosen to accept the secondary bonds theoretically, but she deserves to know concretely. And I want to hear from her, not from you, not from research, that she's genuinely all right with it." A pause. "I'm not going to be someone who exists in the gaps between someone else's discomfort. If I'm in, I need it to be real." Harry looked at her for a long moment, and felt something in his chest that was not the warmth and not the low note but both of them and something additional, something that was specifically about Hermione Granger, the particular quality of her that never settled for the convenient version when the honest version was available. "She'll be in the courtyard after dinner," he said. "I know where she is," Hermione said, with a very slight edge that told him she'd been paying attention for a while. She stood and collected her things with the decisive efficiency she used when she was nervous and masking it with motion. At the door she stopped. "For the record," she said, without turning, "the secondary bond research says that the pull is strongest when the primary mate is in proximate danger. I've been feeling it at an unusual frequency lately." Harry said nothing. "That's a statement of fact," she said. "Not a confession." "I know," Harry said. "Stop saying that," she said, and left. Harry sat in the library with a small, genuine smile and turned a page. Hermione found Fleur. He didn't know exactly what passed between them in the hour they spent in the south courtyard. He was in the castle deliberately, working through the formal declaration documents Daphne had quietly passed him via a third-year Slytherin acting as unwitting courier, but he knew the outcome when Hermione came back. She came back with her expression composed and her eyes a specific shade that meant she'd been crying and had dealt with it, and she sat down across from him and said, "She's extraordinary." "Yes," Harry said. "She was." Hermione paused, choosing words with unusual care. "She was possessive about it, initially. And honest about being possessive, which I respected enormously." She said. Hermione stopped again and looked at her hands. "She said that Veela instinct wants to be the only. But that Veela instinct also recognizes quality, and that she can feel the secondary bonds and she can feel that they're," she paused. "Real," Harry supplied. "She said worthy," Hermione said quietly. "She said the secondary bonds are worthy of him, which is how Veela measure it. Not whether they're a threat to the primary bond but whether they're," she looked up. "Whether they're good enough." The warmth in his chest was full and steady. "And?" Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "She said yes," she said. "And she said if I ever hurt you she would hex me across the channel," which I found both threatening and somewhat reassuring about her priorities. Harry smiled. "How do you feel?" Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific honesty she gave him when she decided to, like something that was fighting became something that was moving in a direction. She paused. "Which is terrifying and also considerably better." Harry held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." She looked at him for a moment longer, that open, unguarded look, and then pulled out her quill and said, briskly, "Show me the declaration documents." Daphne was the harder conversation, and he was the one who had it. He found her in the stone corridor outside the Slytherin common room entrance on a Thursday evening, leaving the library alone in the way she often did when she'd stayed late enough that the others had gone. He fell into step beside her and she didn't startle, which meant she'd heard him coming, which meant she'd been listening for him. "Your father submitted the position paper," Harry said. "Yes," Daphne said. "Lucius met with Dumbledore 3 days ago." "I know. I'm going to formally declare all active bonds under the voluntary declaration clause before the committee issues an examination notice." He paused. The secondary bonds would be included in that declaration. Daphne walked for several steps without speaking. Her profile was its precise, contained self, but he had learned, over 3 years of careful watching, the tells that she couldn't fully eliminate, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands worked slightly in her pockets when she was managing something large. "My father," she said, "would respond to a public declaration of a secondary bond between his daughter and Harry Potter by severing the family relationship." She said it with the flat precision of fact. He would do it within the week. The neutrality position becomes untenable if we're perceived as having aligned with you publicly. "I know," Harry said. "And my mother would." She stopped. "My mother would support him." "And Astoria?" Harry said. He'd done his research. Her younger sister, 12 years old, currently in 2nd year at Hogwarts. Daphne's jaw worked very slightly. "Astoria would be," she stopped again. "Astoria is the only one who would not." A pause. "She's already been writing me letters about you. About what she's heard of you. She is 12 and spectacularly unsubtle." Harry felt something careful and warm for the 12-year-old girl he'd never spoken to. "This has to be your choice," he said. "Completely. I won't, the bond doesn't give me any claim on what you decide here. Whatever you choose is the right choice." Daphne stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood in the corridor with the torchlight doing its unsteady work on the stone. She looked at him. Not the assessing look, not the careful managing look. Just Daphne, straight and honest. The research on secondary bonds says that over extended distance and time, undeclared bonds create a specific kind of internal conflict in the affected party, she said. "I've been having that conflict for 3 years. I know. I am," she said, with the flat honesty of someone stating a mathematical truth, "very tired of the conflict." Harry looked at her. "Then, I'm not choosing this because of the bond," she said, cutting him off. "Not sharply, precisely. I want to be clear about that. The bond is a pull. It's real and I feel it and I'm done pretending I don't. But what I'm choosing is, you. Specifically. A person I have been watching for 3 years who is exactly what he appears to be, which is something I have not encountered in my family's world, where everything is layers." She held his gaze. "I choose the person. The bond is context." Harry held her gaze. "I choose the person too," he said. "Always." Something in Daphne Greengrass shifted, quietly and completely, like a lock releasing. She stood in the torchlight and looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years the careful management of her expression was simply absent. She wasn't soft without it. She was sharper, actually. More herself. "My father is going to be furious," she said. "Yes. And I am going to have to be the one who manages Astoria's situation at home until, I know," Harry said. "We'll work on that." She looked at him. "We," she said. "We," he said. A pause. "Then, I'll sign the declaration." "Thank you," Harry said. She looked at him for another moment with those precise gray eyes, and then something crossed her face that was new, not the beginning of warmth but warmth itself, arrived, present, real. She turned and walked toward the Slytherin common room entrance, and at the portrait she turned back. "Potter," she said. "Greengrass," he said. "Call me Daphne," she said, and went through the portrait. Harry stood in the corridor for a moment and felt all three notes in his chest, primary warmth and two secondary tones, all present, all real, and the structure of it was complete in a way it hadn't been before. Not closed. Not finished. But complete in the sense of having all its parts. He went to find Tonks. Tonks was harder to find than the others because she was not at Hogwarts, which was a logistical complication he handled by sending Hedwig with a note that said, "I need to speak with you in person before the end of term. It's important." And then, after a pause, "You already know what it's about." She arrived the following Saturday, which was impressively fast, which meant she'd either been expecting the note or had been already planning to come, both of which said the same thing. He met her in the Hogsmeade parlor above the Three Broomsticks. She was already there when he arrived, which was also unusual. Tonks was consistently slightly late, by the 2 to 4 minute margin of someone who moved quickly but managed her own time loosely. Being early meant she'd been managing something internally and had needed the extra time to settle it. She was sitting with her hands around a cup of tea, and her hair was its default pink but her eyes were amber, which he'd learned meant the unmanaged version of her. He sat down across from her. "Lucius Malfoy," she said, before he could speak. "Yes," he said. "The Declaration approach," she said. "Voluntary Declaration Clause." "I know it." A pause. "Auror training." "Yes," Harry said. She looked at her tea. "I'm a ministry employee," she said. "An active Auror. If Lucius has enough influence with the committee, which he does, a public declaration of a secondary bond with an active investigation subject could be used to call my professional impartiality into question. He could use it to have me reassigned, suspended pending review, or removed from the task force that's currently monitoring Death Eater activity." Harry said nothing. "He would do exactly that," Tonks said. "He's thorough. It's what I would do if I were trying to neutralize someone." "I know," Harry said. "Which is why I need to tell you it has to be completely your choice. The professional risk is real and it's not, Harry," she said. He stopped. She looked up from her tea. Her amber eyes were very direct. "I've known what this was since October of your 3rd year," she said. I have been very professionally responsible about it." A pause. "And very annoyed about it." "I know," Harry said, with something in his voice that was almost apologetic. She looked at him. "I'm 25, she said. "You're 14. "I know. Nothing is happening, I want that to be completely clear, until you're an adult," Harry said. "I know. That's not what this is about." She held his gaze. "I know what it's about," she said. "The declaration is about protecting the bond from Lucius's legal mechanism. It's not," she stopped and seemed to collect herself and start again. "I can handle the professional risk," she said. "I'm good enough at my job that a reassignment doesn't end my career, and if it comes to an investigation I'll handle it the same way I handle everything, by being better than whoever's trying to stop me." She looked at him steadily. "What I'm not able to handle is pretending this isn't real because it's inconvenient." "I'm not asking you to," Harry said. "I know," she said. She stopped. "That's the thing, actually. That's the thing that makes this difficult and also the thing that makes it," she seemed to hunt for a word and then gave up looking for a precise one and said, "not terrible. Knowing you're not asking me to pretend." Harry held her gaze. "Are you in?" he said. A pause. Her hair shifted, very briefly, to something between pink and gold. "Yes," she said. "I'm in." "Thank you," Harry said. She made a sound. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "If Lucius comes for my career I'm going to be very annoyed and you'll hear about it." "I look forward to it," Harry said, which surprised a laugh out of her that she immediately tried to contain and failed. She looked at him across the table, amber-eyed and real, and Harry felt the third note in his chest settle fully into place, warm and low and his. "Merlin," Tonks said. "You're 14. "Temporarily," Harry said. She groaned into her tea and he felt the third note laugh. The declaration was filed on the 14th of May. All parties signed. The ministry clerk who processed it was a small, competent woman named Edgecombe who looked at the document, at the names on it, and then at Harry with an expression that suggested she understood the significance and had decided to process it efficiently and say nothing. She stamped it in 4 places, filed it in the active register, and said, "Confirmation copies will be sent to all parties and to the committee within 48 hours. "Thank you," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, quietly, "The voluntary declaration supersedes compelled examination and removes the committee's standing to investigate. I thought you should know that explicitly, since the notice of investigation from Lord Malfoy's office arrived this morning." "How close was it?" Harry said. 6 hours, she said. "You were 6 hours ahead of a compelled examination notice." 6 hours. Harry exhaled through his nose. "Thank you," he said again, with more in it. She nodded and turned back to her files, and Harry walked out of the ministry building and into the Muggle Street and stood in the thin London sun and felt the warmth in his chest, all of it, primary and secondary, all present, all registered, all real, and let it settle. Lucius Malfoy received the confirmation copy that afternoon. Harry wasn't there to see his face. But Daphne, via a brief and pointed letter to her father that she'd written and sent before the declaration was filed, had ensured that he would understand what had happened and who had made it happen and that it was irreversible. The response from Lucius came 2 days later, not to Harry. Lucius Malfoy was too controlled for direct engagement, but through channels, a ripple of ministry pressure that touched the edges of Harry's world without landing anywhere useful. A memo to the Hogwarts Board of Governors about student conduct and magical bond disclosures. An inquiry to Gringotts about Harry's vault access that went nowhere because Harry had preemptively arranged his financial standing the previous summer in a conversation with his account manager that Lucius's lawyers couldn't easily get around. A letter to Fleur Delacour that Harry was fairly sure contained something intended to create doubt. He found out about the Delacour letter from Fleur, who appeared at the castle the day after the declaration was filed with the energy of someone who had received news and made a decision about it within approximately 4 seconds. She found Harry on the grounds and said, in French, very fast and very clear, "My mother received a letter from Lucius Malfoy suggesting that you entered the declaration to leverage the Delacour name for political protection and that the bond is being managed rather than honored." Harry looked at her. "I told my mother," Fleur continued, still in French, "that if she believed this, she did not know you and she did not know me. And I told her that I had met with Hermione Granger last week and that I knew exactly who the secondary bonds were with and that I had chosen to accept this and that if the Malfoy family had a problem with it they could," she paused, apparently selecting from several available French expressions, "discuss it with my grandmother." "What would your grandmother do?" Harry said. "My grandmother," Fleur said, with a specific satisfaction, "is the full Veela eldest of the Villeneuve line and has not been concerned with ministry politics since 1953 when she persuaded the entire French Magical Assembly to reverse a regulation by walking into their chambers without notice and looking at them." She paused. "She would eat Lucius Malfoy's political capital alive." Harry looked at Fleur for a moment and felt something that was partly impressed and partly deeply fond. "What did your mother say?" Fleur's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile but was more complicated. "She said she would call Grandmere." "Good," Harry said. Fleur looked at him. They were standing in the May sunshine on the Hogwarts grounds, and she had silver hair and pale eyes and the specific energy of someone who had been fighting something for you and wanted you to know it. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "About the Malfoy pressure. About what was happening with the committee." "You were in the middle of a tournament," Harry said. "I am always in the middle of something," she said. "This does not mean I should not know what is happening." She looked at him with those direct eyes. I am your mate. Not someone to be managed around difficulties. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. I'll do better. She looked slightly thrown, as Hermione had been, as everyone was, when he simply agreed. Then she looked at him with that complicated, real expression and said, more quietly, the declaration. You declared all the bonds. Yes. To protect them. To protect everyone in them, Harry said. Including you. She was quiet for a moment. The May sun was warm on the grounds and the lake was silver, and she was looking at him with the full quality of her attention, which he had learned to recognize as Fleur without guard, Fleur choosing to be present rather than positioned. I know, she said. She stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, over the warmth, and he felt it respond to her touch the way it always did, with the specific deep pulse of something recognizing what belonged to it. It has been doing that since I was 7, she said, feeling it under her palm. Yes, he said. Mine, she said, very quietly. Not possessive, claiming, which was different, which was I know what this is and I choose it. Yes, he said. She looked up at him and the composed Beauxbatons bearing was entirely gone, and what was there was a 17-year-old girl who had been waiting for 7 years in her own specific patient way, and he brought his hand up to cover hers where it rested on his chest. They stood like that in the sunshine, hand over the warmth, and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. Lucius Malfoy's next move came quickly, because he was thorough, and thorough men who have lost one position move to the next one. The next position was Daphne's family. Cyrus Greengrass sent a formal letter of family severance to Daphne 3 days after the declaration. Harry knew about it within 20 minutes because Daphne appeared in the library with her expression at its most precisely controlled and a piece of parchment in her hand and sat down across from him and put it on the table. He read it. It was cold and formal and complete. Severance of family name usage pending formal Greengrass Family Council, freeze of personal funds, removal from the family estate's Fleur network. He looked at the date at the bottom. This is from yesterday, Harry said. He held it for 2 days, Daphne said. Probably waiting for me to reconsider. She paused. I didn't reconsider. No, Harry said. You wouldn't. She held his gaze. Astoria is still at home, she said. She's 12. She can't, she stopped. I need to know she's going to be all right. I'll write to Sirius, Harry said immediately. He has contacts outside the traditional family networks. And I'll speak to Dumbledore about whether there are provisions. I've already spoken to Dumbledore, Daphne said. This morning. He's aware. A pause. He offered the use of school resources and his personal influence if Astoria requires. She stopped. Then, he was very kind about it. I did not expect that. He is kind, Harry said. He's also political and occasionally opaque. But the kindness is real. Daphne looked at him. You've thought about him carefully. I've thought about everyone carefully, Harry said. I know, she said, and it sounded different from the way she usually said it, warmer, less contained. He looked at the severance letter. The financial freeze is an issue, he said practically. For the term's remainder and the summer. I have personal savings outside the family accounts, Daphne said. Not extensive. Sufficient for the short term. I have a vault that's significantly underused, Harry said. We'll work out something practical that isn't charity and doesn't compromise your independence. She looked at him with the precise attention of someone checking for condescension or performance and finding neither. All right, she said. We'll get Astoria out, Harry said. I promise you that. However, it needs to happen. She held his gaze for a long moment, and the low note in his chest was present and warm, and Daphne Greengrass looked at him with her precise gray eyes and said nothing, but what was in her expression was complete and honest and made the low note surge. Then she folded the severance letter neatly and put it in her bag and pulled out her charms notes and said, "The declaration will be confirmed at the next full Wisengamot session. We should prepare a formal response to any committee challenge." "Already drafted," Harry said, producing 3 pages of closely written notes. She looked at them. Then at him. "Of course you have," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and Harry felt the low note go up a full tone. They worked. The library was quiet around them. 2 floors up, Hermione was in the Transfiguration section with a set of books about bond law and a quill moving fast. Outside on the grounds, Fleur was running the lakeshore in the morning way she had, silver hair and long stride, and somewhere in the ministry a pink-haired Auror was reading a confirmation copy of a declaration with her amber eyes and thinking things she hadn't decided to say yet. Lucius Malfoy was somewhere in London revising his strategy, because he was thorough and he had lost 2 consecutive positions and he was not the kind of man who stopped. Harry knew this. He was ready for it. He was the wall. He had always been the wall. But he was not alone inside it anymore, and the difference between a wall that stood alone and a wall with foundations was everything. He turned a page and kept working.